One morning in November of 2011, a wheelchair-bound woman and her full-time caregiver were at home when there was a knock on the front door. The caregiver got up and walked over to the door and opened it up, but there was no one there. And when she looked up and down the road, she didn't see anybody walking or driving away, which was kind of odd. But then she looked down and noticed there was what appeared to be a gift sitting on the front porch, but there was no tag on it. So the caregiver brought the gift inside and put it on the kitchen table and told the woman she was caring for that because this package was not labeled, for now they shouldn't open it. However, later that day, when the caregiver was not paying attention, the woman in the wheelchair was so curious about what this gift was that she grabbed the gift, went into the other room, and opened it up. And the second she did that, absolute chaos ensued. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to teach the Amazon Music follow button how to ride a bike, and the second they actually start to get it, go ahead and stick a huge branch into their front wheel as they drive by. Okay, let's get into today's story. On November 24th, 2011, 23-year-old Victoria Shakte sat in her wheelchair at the dining room table inside of her apartment in Innisfail, Alberta, Canada. On the kitchen table sat a fresh pizza, and then a balloon was tied to the back of one of the chairs. Victoria and her full-time caregiver, Ballen, were celebrating. Marlene, who was originally from the Philippines, had just received her permanent resident status in Canada. This meant that Marlene now was able to receive a range of social benefits provided by the country, and she could now take steps towards becoming an official Canadian citizen. So this was a huge deal for Marlene, and Victoria was just so happy for her. But despite being such good friends and having so much in common and just really getting along, the two women really could not have looked more different. Victoria had dyed red and blonde hair, she had a pierced nose, and she loved wearing really bright colors, in particular red. As for Marlene, she was much more modest. She had dark eyes and dark hair that she always kept perfectly combed, and then even when she wasn't working, she dressed very sensibly. But for anybody who knew these two, Victoria and Marlene seemed like sisters most of the time, and Victoria relied on Marlene more than anybody else in her life. When Victoria was just 16 years old, she had been in this terrible car accident. Her friend, who was driving, was speeding at over 140 miles per hour when they lost control and flipped the car. The accident had left Victoria a quadriplegic, which meant she suffered significant paralysis below her neck. Now, at the time, Victoria's friends and family were obviously so relieved that Victoria had survived the accident. But, looking at her paralysis, her friends and family were worried that Victoria's life would ever go back to being even close to what it used to be. But even at a young age, Victoria had always been very resilient and put her faith wholly in God. And so through the years of extensive medical treatments, she always stayed positive and strong. And over time, she had actually regained some movement in her arms and hands, and she had sort of built a new life for herself. Now, that life was very different from the one she had growing up, but she still cherished it. And Victoria's life had only gotten better when Marlene had become her caregiver and physiotherapist 3 years earlier. In addition to helping Victoria with her physical therapy, Marlene helped prepare food, she got Victoria ready for the day, and she kept the apartment clean. Marlene also helped look after Victoria's 7-year-old daughter, Destiny. Back at the kitchen table, Marlene and Victoria ate their pizza and talked about how exciting it was that Marlene was now one step closer to becoming a Canadian citizen. After they finished eating, Marlene got up and began to clean the kitchen, and Victoria wheeled herself down the hall to her daughter's room. Destiny's door was cracked open, and Victoria could see her daughter sleeping soundly. Victoria smiled. There were times when she looked at her daughter and just felt like bursting out into tears of joy, because she believed her daughter really was a miracle. When Victoria had gotten into that car accident, she was 4 months pregnant. Victoria had been pinned in the wrecked car for 45 minutes before EMTs could get to her, and by the time she was taken to the hospital, she feared she had lost the baby. But 5 months later, her daughter had been born happy and healthy. Victoria chose the name Destiny because she felt like it had been her destiny to have this little girl. Then, years later, Victoria and her daughter had moved to the small town of Innisfail, which is said to get its name from an Irish word that meant Isle of Destiny. So, watching her daughter sleep soundly that night, Victoria felt like, everything that had happened in her life, including the accident that paralyzed her, had happened for a reason, and that she was meant to be exactly where she was right now with Destiny and with Marlene. Later in the evening, Victoria was starting to feel worn out, so she asked Marlene for some help. Victoria said she needed to make an important phone call, so Marlene pushed her down the hall to a small home office, and then she left. That way Victoria could have some privacy on her call. Then Victoria called her financial advisor, Brian Malley. Brian had been a friend of the family for years. He ran a successful construction business, and he had played a huge role in making Victoria's ground floor apartment more wheelchair accessible for her. Brian also owned a small financial firm in town where he worked with locals and people in the area, helping them invest, balance budgets, and manage their money. And managing money had been another major way that Brian had been helping Victoria. Years after her accident, Victoria had sued the person who had been driving the car that hit her, and she had been awarded a settlement of about 575,000 Canadian dollars. With so much money, Victoria had turned to Brian for some guidance, and he had worked to help her make some smart investments and to limit her spending. Brian answered the phone, and for a few minutes, he and Victoria just caught up on what was going on in their lives. Victoria told him the good news about Marlene becoming a permanent resident, and Brian told Victoria that he was excited because he was making the 2-hour drive to Edmonton for business, and so his wife could go to the opera. After a few minutes of this, Victoria finally brought up the reason that she had actually called. She needed Brian to move several $1,000s from her investment account into her checking account to cover her rent and bills and things like that. Victoria immediately heard Brian exhale sort of frustratedly. He told her he was getting concerned about her spending and that her investment account had really begun to dwindle significantly over the past year. Brian tried not to sound too harsh, but he told Victoria that he really couldn't understand why she wasn't sticking to the budget they had laid out for her. Victoria fell silent for a second, and then in a very quiet voice, she said to Brian that the reason she needed more money was to help her family. Brian said he totally understood how important taking care of family was to Victoria, but he said, you're one of 5 kids and you're giving too much money to your siblings. Now, even though Brian did not specifically say this, Victoria knew what Brian was really saying was there was one sibling in particular that Victoria was helping that Brian did not agree with, and that was one of her brothers. The young man had a very serious history of drug use, and Brian was very sure he was just throwing away the money Victoria was giving him to feed his drug addiction. But ultimately, Brian knew it was Victoria's decision what she did with her money, and so Brian said he would call his office and see what he could do about moving the money. But he urged Victoria to really think hard about whether it was worth giving away all this money. After Victoria hung up, she found herself thinking about her family. After she had gotten that court settlement, her first instinct was to use that money to better the lives of everybody in her family, and she had done that, and she was really happy about it. And so even though she knew Brian was making a good point that maybe it was not the best decision to give all her money away to her siblings, she just felt like she had to. And in fact, she couldn't even imagine not helping her siblings or her family out at this point. In particular, her brother who was struggling with drugs. In fact, Victoria believed her kind of red flag brother deserved the most help out of anybody because of his drug use. A couple of minutes later, Victoria called out to Marlene and asked her to come into the study. When she did, Marlene took Victoria and wheeled her to Victoria's bedroom. There, Marlene massaged Victoria's legs like she did every night, and then she helped her get ready for bed. They talked through their plan for the following day. Destiny had to be at school early, and then Victoria wanted to go see her stepfather. Then after that, they said goodnight to each other, and then Marlene stepped out of the room. For a little while, Victoria just lay awake in bed, feeling more stressed out than usual. And the reason she was stressed was about her money. She was thinking about what Brian said and whether or not it was a good idea to be giving all her money to her siblings and her family. And Victoria, she hated thinking about money. It really stressed her out to begin with. But she also told herself that she was going to see her stepfather the following day, and he always had great advice for her. And so maybe he would have some great financial advice. And so with that in mind, and also Victoria's steadfast belief that, no matter her problems, God had a plan for her, Victoria was able to eventually drift off to sleep. The The next morning, so November 25th, 2011, Victoria and Marlene woke up early and made Destiny breakfast and got her off to school. Then, back at the apartment, Marlene helped Victoria get ready to go see her stepfather. But right as they were about to leave, there was a knock at the front door. Marlene walked across the living room and opened the door, but there was nobody there. She looked out into the street, but didn't see anybody walking off. Then Marlene looked down at the porch, and she saw there was this large, shiny green and gold gift bag that had no tag on it, and so Marlene just picked it up and stared for a second, wondering who had sent it and who it was for. Marlene walked back inside carrying the gift, and she told Victoria that she didn't think it was a good idea to open it right now because they had no idea where it came from. But Victoria thought Marlene was acting paranoid. To Victoria, this gift was clearly just an early Christmas present. Marlene disagreed and even suggested they should call the police. Victoria rolled her eyes and said that was a huge overreaction, but she could tell Marlene felt really uncomfortable about this gift, so Victoria promised she would not open it up. Marlene put the gift in the kitchen, and then she and Victoria left and went to go see Victoria's stepfather, who lived only a few minutes away. When they got there, Victoria's stepfather greeted the two women with a huge smile on his face, and he welcomed them into his home. A few minutes after they got there, Marlene helped Victoria to the shower. Victoria's stepfather's shower was actually much more accessible than her own, and so Victoria really enjoyed using it anytime she visited. But the shower also gave her an excuse to catch up with her stepfather. The two had been very close since he came into Victoria's life when she was a young girl, and she often turned to him for advice. So, after her shower, Victoria told her stepfather about the money issues she was having that she spoke to her financial advisor, Brian, about the day before. And just like Brian, Victoria's stepfather was also pretty visibly concerned about the fact that Victoria's money was dwindling so quickly. He told her that it was noble that she liked to help everybody she loved, but she needed to remember that that money was hers, and taking care of herself and her daughter should really be her priority, not everybody else. They talked a while longer, and then eventually Victoria asked him if he knew anything about the early Christmas present that had just shown up on her doorstep. At this point, Marlene jumped into the conversation and told Victoria's stepfather that there hadn't been a card or a tag or anything on this present, and she hadn't seen who had left it at the door. And then Marlene said, I told Victoria that we should not only not open this gift, but we should also call the police and let them handle it. And as Victoria's stepfather listened to this, he too started feeling pretty paranoid about this gift. And he told Victoria that, yeah, you should call the police and definitely do not open that bag. You don't know what it is. Victoria couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why was everybody so worried about this early Christmas present? Come on. But at the same time, Victoria did not want to upset people, so she told her stepfather that she would not open the gift. A little bit later, Victoria thanked her stepfather for having them over. She told him she loved him, and then she and Marlene headed home. They got back to the apartment just before 9 a.m. Marlene walked right to the kitchen and began washing dishes from breakfast. She grabbed a plate off the counter and began running water over it, when suddenly there was this huge bang that echoed through the apartment, and the entire apartment shook, and parts of the ceiling began coming down. And Marlene, she began screaming because she had no idea what was going on. She figured this must be an earthquake, but she didn't know. And so after a second of just pure terror and shock, Marlene turned and ran out of the kitchen and went into the living room yelling out for Victoria, because again, she has no idea what's going on here. But when Marlene saw Victoria, she was slumped forward in her wheelchair and blood was pouring out of her neck. And so Marlene just ran through all the dust and the smoke in the room and went out the front door and just started screaming for help at the top of her lungs. A neighbor who lived not far from Victoria's small apartment building had come out of his house after hearing that very loud noise. And now he looked up the street and he saw Marlene screaming for help. And so the neighbor immediately grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and ran to Marlene. And when he reached Marlene, he could see very clearly that she had cuts on her body and she was bleeding. But Marlene kept saying, "Somebody needs to go inside. Victoria needs help." And the neighbor happened to be a former volunteer firefighter, so he ran into the apartment without hesitation. Once he was inside, there was all this dust and smoke in the air, and it really made it hard to breathe, and he began to cough. But eventually, after walking through the haze, he saw Victoria in her wheelchair, and so he rushed over to her, and he saw she wasn't moving, and so he reached down to check for a pulse or any sign of life. But after a few seconds of just looking at Victoria, it was clear she was already deceased. and so the neighbor ran back out of the house and sat down next to Marlene, who was collapsed on the ground crying, and just took her hand and tried to comfort her as best as he could as they waited for the emergency personnel to arrive. Seconds later, fire trucks, police cruisers, and an ambulance roared through the small town of Innisfail, and they arrived in front of Victoria's apartment just minutes after the neighbor had made that 911 call. First responders helped Marlene and the neighbor off the lawn and then tended to Marlene's cuts. There was no active fire going on inside the apartment, but still, firefighters were the first to go inside. And when they got in there, they quickly identified that clearly an explosion had happened inside of this apartment. And from what they were seeing, the explosion had not been accidental. Someone had set off an incendiary device. And so the firefighters went back outside, and they would contact local, regional, and national authorities about what they had just found inside of the apartment. Not long after those calls, members of the explosives disposal unit arrived. Members of the EDU are national and regional Canadian police officers trained to detect, disarm, and dispose of explosive devices like bombs. Several EDU officers filed out of a truck in front of Victoria's apartment. They wore these huge 90-pound bomb suits made from protective materials like Kevlar, and they had helmets and blast shields that covered their heads and faces. Several of Marlene's neighbors had come out onto their porches to watch, and from their perspective, it almost looked like a group of astronauts had invaded their street. Inside of Victoria's apartment, the explosives unit did a thorough sweep of every room to make sure there was no longer a bomb threat, and they concluded that the apartment was clear, and so it was time now for investigators and forensic analysts to take over. Corporal Kenmore Deep de Hill of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is Canada's national police force, arrived at Victoria's apartment with several forensic investigators right behind him. De Hill quickly met with the officers who had gotten to the scene first, and they filled him in with information they had taken from Marlene. They told him the woman who had died inside the apartment was Victoria Shockday. She was 23 years old, and she was a quadriplegic. The officers also said that Marlene had told them about some sort of mysterious gift that had been dropped off outside of the apartment earlier that morning without any kind of card or tag on it. De Hill nodded and then scanned the street. The neighbors had now gotten even closer to the scene, trying to figure out what had happened. The officers pushed them back and told them they needed to stay a safe distance away from Victoria's apartment. Amidst this growing crowd, De Hill saw Marlene. She was sitting with first responders with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He could tell she was in shock. De Hill wanted to talk to her, but first he wanted to get a better idea of what he was dealing with. So he thanked the officers he was talking with for their help, and then De Hill stepped inside the apartment. Forensics analysts told him that they had already found pieces of a galvanized steel pipe, traces of gunpowder, and a lantern battery, clear signs of a homemade bomb. De Hill tried to take in the entire scene. Parts of the walls and floors had been ripped apart, pieces of furniture had gaping holes in them, debris were scattered everywhere, and strands of plaster hung down from the ceiling like confetti. But the real horror was where Victoria was, in the dining room. De Hill walked into the dining room and approached Victoria. She was sitting in her wheelchair with her head slumped forward. De Hill saw multiple serious wounds on Victoria's neck, as well as bloodstains on her skin and all over her torn clothes. De Hill didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but he had been a member of the Major Crimes Unit for years, and he knew that homicides involving pipe bombs like this were often connected to drug gangs. But that just didn't make sense to De Hill. The victim was a young woman who was paralyzed and who had no criminal history at all. Why would she be mixed up with a drug gang? Corporal De Hill made his way down the hall to the bedrooms. He looked into Destiny's bedroom, and all he could think was how glad he was that Victoria's little girl had been at school when this happened. Minutes later, someone shouted for De Hill out in the dining room. So De Hill stopped what he was doing, and he walked down the hall to the dining room, and when he got there, De Hill saw a forensics officer crouched down, staring at something on the ground. She was staring at something that she just uncovered from the dust and the pieces of the ceiling that had fallen to the floor, and she could not believe what she was looking at. De Hill knelt down beside her, and he looked at what she was staring at, and what he saw was a piece of paper with Victoria's name written on it in colored ink. Marlene had previously told the officers that this Christmas present they received did not have a tag on it, but this piece of paper definitely looked like a tag that would go on a gift, at least to DeHill. The forensics officer told DeHill that finding a scrap of paper like this fully intact after an explosion was almost unheard of. And that little piece of paper gave DeHill a jolt of energy, because it could possibly offer a handwriting sample of the bomber. And even more importantly, potentially there could be the bomber's DNA on the paper. So the forensics team bagged up the piece of paper for testing and then continued looking for evidence all throughout the apartment. Later that day, DeHill finally stepped outside of the apartment, and the fresh air felt like it might knock him over. He hadn't realized how difficult it was to breathe inside of the apartment. DeHill caught his breath and then noticed Marlene standing by the road with several officers. The wounds that Marlene had suffered during the explosion wound up being quite minor, so she was able to answer any questions that the officers had. And so DeHill saw this as his chance, and so he walked over to her and introduced himself. Marlene wiped away the tears from her face, and then she told DeHill that she had warned Victoria not to open that gift. And so when DeHill heard this, he followed up with, "Well, Marlene, why were you so worried about this gift? Did you think somebody was planning to attack Victoria?" But Marlene would say, in response to this, that her suspicion about the present had nothing to do with fear that somebody was out to hurt Victoria. She just didn't trust the fact that this present had been dropped off completely randomly a month before the holidays with no tags on it, nothing. It just seemed like something was off about this gift. And then after that, Marlene just sort of broke down. She told DeHill that people loved Victoria and looked to her as an inspiration. Victoria had endured so much for someone so young, but she never let anything stop her. In fact, Victoria often went out of her way to help other people who needed it, whether it was by giving money to her family or volunteering at her church. She was just a very thoughtful person. DeHill told Marlene how sorry he was for her loss and for what she had been through that morning with the explosion. DeHill knew Marlene was physically okay, but he was sure she would never get over what had happened. Then he thanked her for her time and walked back towards the apartment. And as he was on his way, one thing Marlene had said to DeHill really stood out to him, that Victoria apparently gave money to her family. Money, family, and murder often went hand in hand, so DeHill instructed members of his team to begin looking into Victoria's financial situation, and he asked others to track down members of her family for questioning. DeHill still had not formed any serious theories or opinions about who could have delivered this pipe bomb, but he thought maybe in this case, a family dispute over money that maybe erupted into violence might make more sense than a drug gang putting out a hit on somebody like Victoria. So DeHill just needed to figure out who all Victoria was giving money to and who would have benefited from her death. On the night of Victoria's murder, and during the following day, Corporal DeHill and members of his team had contacted and took statements from Victoria's family and friends, and they all basically said the same thing. They loved Victoria. She was a beautiful person and an amazing mother, and they couldn't imagine who would want to hurt her. And Victoria's family were very upfront about the financial aid she had given them all since she'd received her court settlement. But they all insisted that they never wanted to feel like a burden to Victoria and that she helped them because it was something she wanted to do. Now, despite how honest the family and friends seemed to DeHill, he couldn't actually just rule them out because they seemed like good people. The reality was they still needed more information to get to the bottom of Victoria's financial situation to see if that played a role in whatever happened to her. And in conversations with family and friends, DeHill had learned that Victoria had a financial advisor, Brian Malley, who would obviously have a much fuller picture of Victoria's finances. And so DeHill reached out to Brian and asked him to come meet him at a nearby police station. Brian was a 55-year-old guy who was quite tall and had graying hair. He was known for being very polite and outgoing, traits that had really helped him grow his business. Brian told DeHill that he'd actually been a friend of Victoria's family for years, and he had really gotten to know Victoria when he did construction work on her apartment to make it more wheelchair accessible. He also said when he and Victoria began working together on her finances, that also really brought them together, so they were legitimately good friends. DeHill asked him about his investment strategy for Victoria, and Brian would say, the strategy was very standard. His goal was just to add to the money that Victoria already had. That way her and her daughter could be taken care of in the future. And then he also asked Brian if he could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Victoria. And when he asked that question, it was the first time Brian seemed to hesitate. And for a second, DeHill actually thought maybe Brian just didn't hear the question, and he was about to ask it again, but then Brian shook his head and broke the silence and said he just could not imagine anybody wanting to do this to Victoria. It just really didn't make sense. DeHill would ask Brian a few more questions, and Brian would do his best to answer, and then eventually DeHill thanked Brian for coming in, and Brian got up to leave. But even before Brian made it out the door, DeHill found himself thinking how strange it was that Brian had hesitated when he was asked, is there anybody out there that you think might want to hurt Victoria? Everybody else who DeHill had asked that question to, family, friends, witnesses, had all pretty much immediately said, no, there's no one. Nobody would want to hurt her. Or certainly I don't know anybody who would want to hurt her. And Brian had basically had the same answer, but again, he had hesitated. And so it could have just been, a brain fart or he zoned out or something, or maybe there was something more to the hesitation. And so DeHill decided he was going to get to the bottom of it. And DeHill did not need to wait long to get his answer, because the following day, Brian contacted DeHill, and what he said cast Victoria's murder in a whole new light. Brian told DeHill that one of Victoria's brothers, who she gave money to all the time, had a very serious drug problem. He'd been addicted to crack for years. But that wasn't all. Brian also thought there was a real chance that Victoria's brother was a drug dealer and that he had gotten on the wrong side of some pretty serious drug gangs. And so by the time DeHill hung up with Brian, he felt like he had just caught his first major break in this case. One of DeHill's initial thoughts about the crime scene was that the type of homemade bomb used to kill Victoria was often used by people in the drug trade. So DeHill wondered if it was possible that Victoria's brother owed money to drug dealers or had encroached on their territory when dealing drugs on his own or something. And if that was the case, maybe those drug dealers killed Victoria to send a message to her brother. And so soon after this call with Brian, DeHill raced off to go speak with Victoria's brother. And when he did and actually began talking to him, the young man tried to be as helpful as he could, and he admitted openly to struggling with drugs in the past. But he said he never dealt drugs to anyone, and the idea that he had connections to major drug gangs was laughable. DeHill was not ready to just take this guy at his word, but one thing DeHill definitely noticed was Victoria's brother was visibly angry that somebody even suggested that he had something to do with his sister's death. He told DeHill he loved Victoria, probably more than he'd loved anybody else in the world. And so after this meeting ended, DeHill did not think he had just gotten any closer to solving the case. However, at the same time, he wasn't ready to just drop the possible connection between drugs and Victoria's murder. And so for now, at least, that was still the best lead he had. On December 3rd, 2011, so a week after Victoria's murder, 250 people gathered at a funeral home to say their final goodbyes to Victoria and to celebrate her life. DeHill and other police officers attended the funeral as well. It's common for investigators to go to funerals of murder victims to see how their friends and family and other potential suspects behave. DeHill listened to the people who were closest to Victoria talk about what an unbelievably amazing person she was, and as he listened to this, he just struggled to understand how someone as wonderful as Victoria ended up with a homemade pipe bomb getting delivered to her house. Now, DeHill had continued to pursue Victoria's brother's possible connection to drug gangs, and in doing that, he had discovered that years earlier, Victoria had made an anonymous call to the police about her neighbors dealing drugs. But DeHill still didn't know if that call had anything to do with her brother, or if somehow the neighbors had figured out who made the anonymous call and then took their revenge on Victoria. But DeHill just could not fathom why any drug dealer would wait years to exact their revenge for a phone call to the cops that didn't really amount to much. A procession of mourners made their way towards Victoria's casket, but DeHill focused on Victoria's young daughter, Destiny. Whoever had done this to Victoria, whether they were connected to the drug trade or not, had robbed this little girl of her mother and robbed her of a safe, happy childhood. Seeing Destiny struggling so hard just to talk about her mother made DeHill so mad. And he was also very frustrated that still he had not honed in on one or two major suspects yet. But still, DeHill tried to stay steady and level-headed. He had plenty of information to work with. He just needed more time to figure out what it all meant. After the funeral, DeHill returned to the station and met with his team. He decided this case could very well hinge on the old adage, follow the money. If they could track where Victoria's money went after she gave it to her brother, it could lead them to the person or people they were looking for. So, for the next several weeks, investigators looked into Victoria's financial transactions dating back to when she had received her court settlement. And investigators were able to follow a paper trail of where and when Victoria's money moved, and something they found set off a major alarm. Finally, DeHill had a full picture of what Victoria had done with her money, and he was almost positive he now knew who had killed her. DeHill wanted to act fast, but he also wanted his case to be airtight if it went to trial. So he needed a key piece of evidence that he still lacked. Forensics investigators had managed to pull DNA samples from that piece of paper with Victoria's name on it that had somehow survived the explosion. So now, DeHill just had to secure a DNA sample from his newly discovered suspect to see if the DNA matched. Almost 6 months after Victoria's murder, 2 investigators trailed their suspect from an unmarked car. The Major Crimes Unit had secured a warrant that allowed them to conduct surveillance on DeHill's new primary suspect. The surveillance process had been very in-depth, and it had taken a lot of time, but it convinced DeHill even further that he was right about who had murdered Victoria. So now, these 2 investigators who were following the suspect needed to secure a DNA sample from this suspect to back up DeHill's theory. Eventually, the investigators saw the suspect turn off the street and pull into the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. The investigators could not believe their luck. This was the perfect place to get a DNA sample. From inside their unmarked car out in the parking lot, the investigators watched the suspect get out of their car and walk inside the restaurant. The investigators waited a minute, and then they too got out of their car and they went inside as well. The investigators bought food just to blend in, and then took a seat in a booth towards the back and kept an eye on their suspect. Eventually, the suspect finished their meal, threw their trash into the trash can, and walked outside. And at this point, the investigators sprung into action. They put gloves on their hands, walked over to the trash can, and began fishing around inside of it until they pulled out a napkin the suspect had used to wipe their hands and mouth, and they slipped that napkin into a paper bag. And soon after that, the napkin was sent off for DNA testing. It took a while for the results to come back, but when they did, they showed DeHill exactly what he had been looking for. They were a match. DeHill had found Victoria's murderer. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and police interviews, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on November 25th, 2011, the morning that somebody murdered Victoria Schachté. The sun wouldn't rise for hours, but the killer was already hard at work. They sat at a wooden table staring at their creation. They had spent months collecting the necessary items to complete the project, and now they were finally ready to finish it and put it to use. The killer took a big breath in and exhaled slowly through their mouth. They told themselves that staying calm was key. Shaky hands or sudden movements could be very dangerous. The killer slowly put the finishing touches on the pipe bomb, then backed away from the table and let out a huge breath and felt their shoulders relax. They reached down and picked up a white cardboard box off the floor, and they carefully set the bomb inside of the box. They closed the box and then grabbed a piece of paper and a colored pen, and they wrote the word Victoria in large, festive-looking letters on the paper and then taped it to the top of the cardboard box. Finally, the killer picked up a large green and gold gift bag and placed the box inside. A few minutes later, the killer drove through Innisfail and arrived on Victoria's street. They drove a little ways past her apartment and then parked their car. Then, after pulling their dark cap down to cover their face, the killer stepped out of the car and looked up and down the street. It was empty. So they reached into the passenger seat and took the heavy gift bag containing the bomb, and they walked carefully towards Victoria's apartment. As they moved, they did their best to stay in the shadows and avoid the streetlights. Finally, the killer reached Victoria's apartment, and they placed the gift bag down right in front of the front door, and then the killer knocked on the door and then turned and ran away as fast as they could. By the time Marlene opened the door, the killer was already gone. Hours later, at around 9 a.m., Victoria and Marlene returned from Victoria's stepfather's house, and right away, Marlene headed to the kitchen to do the dishes. But while she was at the sink, she didn't hear or see Victoria, who wheeled herself into the kitchen as well, and Victoria grabbed the gift bag off the kitchen table where Marlene had left it, she put it on her lap, and then wheeled herself into the dining room. Victoria opened up the bag and saw there was a white cardboard box inside. She took the box out and let the bag fall to the floor. And when this happened, Victoria very likely saw that there was a tag on this box. There was that piece of paper that said Victoria in colorful ink. And so for Victoria, this very likely confirmed in her head that Marlene and her stepfather were overreacting about this box. Clearly, this was just an early Christmas present for Victoria, and it was no big deal. And so Victoria ultimately opened up the box. And when she did, the box exploded. And by the time the explosion actually happened, the killer had already arrived in Edmonton, where he had business to conduct, and where his wife was going to see the opera. Brian Malley, Victoria's family friend and her financial advisor, was her killer. It would turn out the image of a kind, outgoing, successful businessman that Brian showed the world was nothing more than an act that he had spent years cultivating. In reality, Brian was a former cop who had been kicked off the Edmonton police force about 3 years after he had joined. Brian's first wife had divorced him because she believed he was a physical threat to her and their daughter, and his second wife had also divorced him because Brian was having an affair with a coworker. But somehow, Brian had managed to hide all of that, and he sort of reinvented himself when he had moved to the small town of Innisfail. And soon he had established himself as a reliable construction worker, and then later as an honest and trustworthy financial advisor. But the truth was, Brian never really changed, and he made a habit out of using his clients' money for his own gain, making risky and even illegal investments in the hope that he could make some big money on commissions. And he got away with it for a while. But in 2011, Victoria had started to wonder why her large investment account kept dwindling so quickly. When she had asked Brian about it, he just kept saying the problem was that Victoria gave too much of her money away to her family. But when Victoria continued to push him for more information about what was happening, Brian started to panic. Because he had actually invested over 90% of Victoria's money in a single, very high-risk stock. And that stock had just cratered, so almost all of Victoria's money was now gone. And Brian had never consulted Victoria about doing this investment, so she had no idea what had even happened. He also obviously never disclosed the inherent risk of putting so much money into a single stock. Basically, you can lose everything really quickly. Brian knew his actions violated multiple Canadian financial laws, so he decided the only way to avoid getting caught and going to jail was to kill Victoria and pin the murder on her own brother. Now, Victoria's brother had nothing to do with the murder, and it was never shown that he had ever dealt drugs. But ultimately, it was the investigators' initial pursuit of the brother's possible drug connection to this crime that had led DeHill and his team to uncover Brian's financial crimes. But even with all of this information about his financial crimes, DeHill needed something much more concrete to directly connect Brian to the murder. Luckily, that piece of paper Brian had written Victoria on and then taped to the bomb survived the blast, and DNA samples from that paper ended up matching the DNA sample taken from the napkin that Brian had thrown away when he was at the fast food restaurant. And so after finding that match, DeHill and his team moved in and arrested Brian. Brian was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and several charges related to constructing and delivering an explosive device. He was sentenced to life in prison with a chance for parole after 25 years. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
On June 20th, 2004, a restaurant manager stood at the host stand of a seafood spot in Orange County, California. It was the dinner rush, and he was on takeout duty. So, when a fairly frantic customer came in asking about their to-go order, the manager quickly hurried off to grab it. He found the order, and he carried it back, and as he rang this customer up, he could tell this customer was in a huge hurry. They kept looking over their shoulder and tapping their fingers on the counter, and after everything was done, the customer basically took the food and literally ran out. Now, the manager definitely thought this customer was acting really strange. He had never seen anybody sprint out of the restaurant before. But quickly, he got distracted with another order and kind of forgot about the whole thing. That is, until a few days later when police showed up, asking the manager to tell them everything they could remember about that strange customer. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button has a blinding headache, offer them some aspirin. But don't tell them it's not really aspirin, it's just really strong laxatives. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Monday, June 21st, 2004, 72-year-old Jane Thompson drove her car down a road through the city of Laguna Niguel, California. She was on her way home from a weekend trip through Los Angeles, which was about 50 miles north of Laguna Niguel. And because LA was so chaotic and full of activity and constant stimulation, Jane actually really appreciated this commute back home, this 50-mile drive. It was a time to be by herself and sort of decompress from being in the city. So Jane used to live in Los Angeles, where she had worked for decades in the film industry. But she had retired and moved to Laguna Niguel 7 years earlier. And this move had been like a total lifestyle change for Jane, because her career in LA had been fast-paced and exciting. She'd been an assistant to some really important people in Hollywood, and then also she was an award-winning producer, and then a decorator for various Hollywood celebrities. It was sort of very glamorous what she was doing. So even though Jane was generally a pretty quiet person who appreciated her alone time, like driving in the car right now, it still had actually been really hard to completely transition to the slow pace of life outside the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, especially because her girlfriend, Marion Reese, still lived in LA. Jane had known Marion for decades at this point. They'd started out as coworkers because Marion owned a production company and Jane had produced a lot of projects for her. Then at some point years ago, their relationship turned from a, working friendship into a full-blown romance, and they'd been involved ever since. And even though now they lived over an hour's drive apart, they still spent a lot of time together. Jane was actually going back to LA again on Friday because they had tickets to the opera, and then also Marion was going to be joining Jane on a cruise to Europe the following week. But for right now, Jane just kind of looked out her window as she drove by a cluster of houses. And she noticed outside one of those houses, she saw her friend, Mary Larkin, gardening in her front yard. Jane had known Mary for years, and she was really Jane's closest friend in town. They'd spent countless nights talking and drinking wine together, sometimes with Mary's other next-door neighbor, Karen, who had also become a close friend. So, naturally, Jane slowed down in her car, and she rolled down her window, and she called out to Mary to say hello, and to remind her that they were due for a wine night sometime soon, before she left for her cruise. And Mary, after hearing this, nodded enthusiastically and said she would for sure give Jane a call. After that, the two women said their goodbyes, and then Jane kept on driving. And a few minutes later, Jane saw her condo complex's entrance up ahead, and so she threw on her blinker and turned in. And pretty soon, she was surrounded by mostly identical units with orange-tiled roofs that were all packed really close together. But Jane loved her neighborhood. It was on this quiet hillside and less than 4 miles from the ocean, and she just felt completely comfortable there. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, and everybody seemed so warm and welcoming. And this meant a lot to Jane, because she didn't have any kids or living relatives. She was kind of on her own. So it was nice to feel like her neighbors were all looking out for her. As Jane pulled her car into the garage and got out, she looked across the street and saw her teenage neighbor, Sam Nelson, playing basketball in his driveway. Jane tried to get his attention and waved to him just to say hi, but when he looked over and saw her doing that, he kind of put his head down and quickly rushed inside his home. And Jane, she understood why. Clearly, he was embarrassed. So Sam was kind of a troubled kid. He had actually broken into Jane's house just this past Friday while she was out, and he took some of her jewelry. But he wasn't as clever as he thought he was, and Jane had quickly figured out it was him. So before leaving for her recent LA trip, she'd confronted him about it and told him to never do it again. And he was obviously mortified. But she had also told Sam that, she was not going to call the police here. After all, Sam was 15 years old, and he had just made a really dumb mistake. And in Jane's mind, Sam was a part of her beloved community, and so even though he had done something bad to her, she still wanted to look out for him. Plus, really, he hadn't taken anything that was particularly valuable or anything she really cared about, so she felt like she was just giving him a second chance, and this was no big deal. Now, Sam was obviously very appreciative at the time after realizing he was, not going to get in any real trouble here. But it was also clear now that he really didn't want anything to do with Jane. I mean, he was just embarrassed at the sight of her waving to him. But, for Jane, she figured maybe that was just as well. And so, after seeing Sam disappear into his house, Jane just shrugged, turned around, and headed inside her own house. Jane spent the next few days doing things around town, volunteering at the library and taking walks with her weekly walking group. And before she knew it, it was almost time to head back to LA. On Thursday evening, June 24th, so the night before she was set to go to LA, Jane stood in her kitchen making some pasta and thinking about what outfit she was going to wear for the opera in LA the next night. And then after she cooked and ate her dinner, she laid on the couch to watch some TV. Now, she had planned to only watch a little bit and then get some packing done, but pretty quickly she felt her eyelids get heavy, and soon she was fast asleep. 3 days later, on Sunday afternoon, Jane's friend and neighbor, Mary Larkin, the woman she had seen when she was driving home from LA, drove up to Jane's house with their other friend, Karen Hamara, and they jumped right out of the car. Mary had an undeniable knot in her stomach, which had only been getting tighter by the minute ever since Jane's girlfriend, Marianne Reese, had called earlier to say that Jane had never showed up in LA for their trip to the opera, and now she was not answering her phone. And when she heard this, Mary immediately became very worried because, Jane just didn't flake on people without calling. And so given Jane's age, it seemed entirely possible that maybe she had an accident or medical emergency at home and needed help, and that's why nobody could get in touch with her. So after she herself tried calling Jane a few times, but with no luck, Mary had gone over to her neighbor Karen's house and asked her if she would come with her to go to Jane's house, just to make sure Jane was okay. And on their drive over, Mary had convinced herself, despite that feeling in her gut, that, everything would be okay. But now, as she went up Jane's driveway, she could see there were a few newspapers piled up at the end of it, which made her even more anxious that something was wrong here. And so Mary hurried right up the driveway, went to the front door, and began knocking. But as she and Karen stood there, they couldn't hear anything inside the house. Nobody was coming to the door. And so finally they left the porch and went around to the back of Jane's house to try her back door. And when the two women got into Jane's backyard, Mary froze, because she could see the sliding glass door that led into Jane's living room was clearly wide open. And so Mary and Karen, from right there in the yard, just began yelling through the open door for Jane, but there was no answer. Eventually, Karen began to walk towards the open door like she was going to go inside, but Mary instinctively grabbed her and just said, "Don't." She was shaking and could barely think straight, but Mary felt like they just should not go in there, that it was not safe. And so instead, the two women ultimately backed away and went to go call the police. A few minutes later, Mary and Karen stood out on the street in front of Jane's house, watching as a police cruiser pulled up. The women immediately went over to the two deputies that got out, and they tried to explain the situation, that their friend was not responding to phone calls and that their back door was wide open, which just seemed really strange, and nobody knows what's going on. And so the officers asked Mary and Karen to take them to the back of the house where this open door was, and so they walked around the side yard, they went back there, and when they got there, Mary watched as one of the officers just walked up to the open door and stuck his head inside and began to look around. And as soon as he did that, Mary could see his body began to tense up, like he had seen something inside. Mary blurted out like, "Hey, what's going on? What's wrong?" But the officer looking in the home, he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to his partner and told him to secure the scene and call for backup. There was someone inside, and he could already tell they were deceased. Just about an hour later, at around 6 p.m. on June 27, 2004, Detective Daniel Salcedo stopped his cruiser in front of a condo in Laguna Niguel, California. Dispatch hadn't told him much, just that an older woman had been found dead in her condo. When Salcedo got out of his car, he could see that there was police tape all over the condo's front door and the driveway. And just inside the perimeter, there was an officer speaking to two women who were crying and seemed very visibly upset. Dozens of other officers and crime scene technicians were also scattered around the area collecting evidence. And one deputy saw Salcedo and hurried over to give him an update. So the deceased woman had been identified as the owner of the condo, 72-year-old Jane Thompson. And at first glance, it very much appeared like she had been attacked. She had been murdered. Her two friends, the two women who were very upset talking to police, had called the police for a wellness check, and the officers who responded had found Jane lying in the living room. They'd been able to get through her sliding back door because the door was already open. Salcedo glanced back over at the two women in the driveway who were still talking to the police, and Salcedo told the deputy to make sure they stuck around because after he took a look inside, he wanted to speak to them as well. As the deputy hurried off to do what he was told, Salcedo walked around to the back of the house, and when he got there, he saw that not only was the sliding door open, but there really weren't any signs of forced entry around it, which could mean that it had been left unlocked, or that maybe Jane knew her attacker and let them in. And so Salcedo stepped inside the condo. And right away, he saw there were all these technicians all over the place working hard to gather evidence and process the scene. And also what he saw was blood spatter all over the walls and all over the furniture. And then when he looked down at the floor, he saw Jane's body. She was lying face down between her couch and coffee table with a large pool of blood around her head. Salcedo crouched down next to her to get a better look, and he saw her wounds were just brutal. Her head had been so badly pulverized that Salcedo could not only see her skull, the actual bone, but he could actually see the breaks in her skull. Her skull was shattered. Now, Salcedo would have to wait for the autopsy to be sure, but to Salcedo, it was very clear that somebody must have beaten this woman with some kind of heavy object over and over and over again. A couple of minutes later, Salcedo stood back up. Based on the extent of Jane's wounds, it seemed pretty obvious to him that this was a frenzied, rage-filled attack, and that it likely had happened really quickly, or maybe, the attack happened in such a way that Jane was completely caught off guard. Because aside from the awful trauma to Jane's head, Jane didn't appear to have really any other wounds. So it didn't seem like she tried to fight back or defend herself. And aside from the blood spatter, the room around her didn't show any signs of a struggle. It's like she just got destroyed right here and blood went everywhere. Salcedo left Jane's body and searched the rest of her condo. He went in her bedroom, searched her closets, went in the office, went in her kitchen, but there were no signs of anybody ransacking the condo. There was no obvious theft that had taken place, at least at first glance. There were expensive electronics that were still out and not claimed. So to Salcedo, at least right now, he was pretty sure this was not a robbery gone wrong. As he wrapped up his initial walkthrough of the condo, an officer called Salcedo back into the kitchen. And when Salcedo went over, he saw the officer was standing by the landline's answering machine. The officer told Salcedo there were a bunch of new messages on there, and they started the morning of Friday, June 25th. Now, Salcedo was very excited to hear that because that gave them something of a timeline to work off of. Because if Jane had stopped answering her phone by, Friday morning, then that means she could have died maybe overnight on that Thursday the 24th, or maybe even in the morning before that first message came through on the 25th. At least that would be the latest she could have died based on the message. So Salcedo told the officer to be sure to log the tape into evidence. Then Salcedo went back to the living room where Jane's body was and all the texts were, and he just stood there with his arms crossed, thinking about, what's he going to do next? Considering the attack had all the signs of being highly emotional, Salcedo felt confident that Jane's killer was someone who knew her and was deeply angry with her. So the first people he wanted to speak to were those that Jane was closest to, like family, friends, or maybe even romantic partners. Jane appeared to live alone, so he hoped other people in the neighborhood, or maybe those two women who called the police, could tell him more about Jane's personal life, her relationships, and give him a place to start. So Salcedo grabbed a few officers, and they headed outside to begin asking some questions. When he got outside, Salcedo could see there was now an audience of people, a crowd of, who Salcedo assumed were residents of this complex that were gathered at the edge of the police perimeter. And Salcedo understood why. Brutal homicides like this one rarely happened in this area, if ever. There was probably going to be a lot of panic and rumors in this community because of it. And based on the literal layout of this complex, the fact that all these condos are basically on top of each other, he knew that, those rumors would likely spread really quickly. But also, the fact these condos were tightly packed together gave Salcedo an advantage. Very likely because people are living on top of each other, somebody might have heard or seen something that could help break this case wide open. Just then, another police cruiser pulled up in front of the house, and a detective named Brian Sutton stepped out of the car. And when Salcedo saw who it was, he immediately felt relieved. Salcedo worked extremely well with Detective Sutton, and interviews were sort of like their specialty. As a duo, they had an instinct for asking the right questions that got people talking. So Salcedo hurried over to Sutton and quickly told him everything he'd learned so far. And once Sutton was up to speed, they went right over to the two women who had called 911. Salcedo was eager to interview them as witnesses, but he also was not ruling out the idea that they could also be suspects. He was sure this had to be a personal crime, and they clearly had some kind of relationship with Jane since they'd come over to check on her. When Salcedo reached the women, he could tell they had calmed down quite a bit from when he had first seen them when he first arrived. And the women, they were composed enough to tell him their names, Mary and Karen. They then explained that they were good friends with Jane and they'd come over to check on her. Because recently, Mary had gotten a call from Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese, who lived in LA, and Marion had been worried because Jane had not shown up in LA for plans they had, and so she was trying to find out where she was she okay? And so Mary and Karen had gone to see if she was okay. This made Salcedo immediately perk up, and he asked Mary for Marion's information. As he jotted down Marion's phone number, Sutton asked the two women where they were on the night of the 24th or early morning of the 25th. So that was 2 nights ago and then also yesterday morning. And both of them said they had alibis. Now, the detectives would have to confirm their alibis because anybody can make up an alibi. But for right now, Salcedo was comfortable ruling Mary and Karen out as suspects. They both seemed genuinely stunned by Jane's murder. And while it did seem like they were good friends with Jane, he wasn't sure they had the kind of intense closeness that might have led to such a vicious attack. So he told the two women they could go home. And then Salcedo nodded to Sutton, and the two of them left the women and headed towards the crowd of neighbors to ask some more questions. The next morning, Monday, June 28th, and Salcedo was behind the wheel of his cruiser with Sutton in the passenger seat. They were almost at the end of their long drive up to Los Angeles to interview Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese. Salcedo was eager to get her statement, because right now, they didn't have that many other leads. The forensics team hadn't found any DNA or fingerprints at the scene to test against future suspects. And the canvas of Jane's condo complex the night before really hadn't yielded much either. They'd learned that no one had seen Jane since Thursday, which backed up the timeline they'd already gotten from the answering machine. But none of the neighbors heard or saw anything strange on that Thursday night. And according to her neighbors, Jane did not have any obvious tension with anybody in the community. She generally kept to herself, but was really well liked by everyone who met her. But Salcedo, again, from what he had just seen at the crime scene, felt sure that someone out there had to have had a problem with Jane. He'd seen the autopsy that morning, and it confirmed that Jane, unsurprisingly, had died from the wounds to her head. But it also told him something else. She'd been hit more than a dozen times. It was complete overkill. And to Salcedo, it meant the killer had to have been driven by some kind of intense emotion, like rage or maybe greed, which was why they were now making this drive out to LA to speak with Marion, who Salcedo felt, based on her relationship to Jane, she was the strongest suspect they had, because romance can make you do crazy things. Also, Salcedo had done some digging into Jane's finances the night before, and he found out she had a life insurance policy worth $100,000, and Marion Reese was the sole beneficiary, which meant Marion definitely had something to gain financially at least from Jane's death. So as they pulled up to Marion's house, Salcedo was thinking, maybe we found our killer. A few minutes later, the detective sat on a couch in Marion Reese's living room. The home was on the small side, even by LA standards, but it was very tastefully decorated. Marianne sat down across from them in an armchair, and when they looked at her, they could see her eyes were very red and puffy, like she'd been crying. She also had a glass of water in her hand that she kept lifting up like she was going to take a sip, but then she would just place it back down again without taking a sip. It was like she didn't know what she was doing. Marianne had clearly already heard about Jane's death, and to Salcedo, she really was showing every sign of genuinely being in shock. So he wanted to be very careful with his line of questions and make sure, he didn't overwhelm her. If she just shut down, he might not get the information that he really needed. So, after a minute, Salcedo began by just asking Marianne how she knew Jane. And Marianne, she took a deep breath, and then with a very shaky voice, she explained that they had known each other for almost 50 years. They used to work together. Jane had done a lot of producing for Marianne's production company. As Marianne went on to describe more about how they met each other and how it kind of transitioned from working together to, romance, Salcedo could sense that Marianne was kind of calming down. And she was calming down to the point where he felt like now he could introduce the tough stuff. So he turned and he nodded to Sutton. And at that point, Sutton asked Marianne if she knew that Jane had named her, Marianne, as the sole beneficiary on her life insurance policy. And Marianne immediately gasped, and she said she had no idea Jane had done that. But she also said it did sort of make sense. She said that Jane really didn't have any family, and in some ways, Marianne was her family, or at least was her closest relationship. Now, Salcedo felt like Marianne's reaction to this was very earnest, but he couldn't be sure. So he pressed her some more, and he asked her where she was last Thursday night when presumably, Jane was killed. But Marianne just said she was with friends all night in LA, and she gave Salcedo all the phone numbers of these friends so he and his partner could confirm it. They talked for a while longer as Marianne went over the details of how Jane missed their opera date on Friday and then stopped returning her calls, and it all lined up with what Jane's friend, Mary, had told them. So eventually, Salcedo and Sutton stood up to leave. Over an hour later, Detective Salcedo and Sutton were back in Laguna Niguel, California, and they parked their cruiser in front of Jane's condo. On their drive back from Marianne's house in LA, the detectives had called some of Marianne's friends to confirm her alibi. And they all confirmed that on the night Jane was killed, they were with her and she was in LA. And so now Salcedo had to admit that Marianne was looking less and less like a suspect. So now the detectives were back at Jane's condo to look into another working theory about what might have happened here. Maybe Jane's murder was a hate crime. So remember, this was back in 2004 when being a homosexual was just not as widely accepted as it is today. And so their theory was, maybe one of Jane's neighbors had seen Marianne, Jane's girlfriend, visiting, or maybe heard about their relationship and they didn't like it, and so they lashed out. And then also strengthening the idea that, one of the neighbors could have done this was the fact that it was sort of common knowledge in this neighborhood that most people left their doors unlocked. And so it sort of strengthened the idea that maybe a neighbor did this, maybe because of their hate towards Jane and her way of life. However, Sutton and Salcedo knew that actually investigating this theory was going to be extremely challenging. There were 144 houses in the complex, and so conducting a thorough investigation of every resident of all those houses was just going to take a lot of time. But they didn't have any other options, so the detectives got to work, and they went to the first house next to Jane's and knocked. A few hours later, Salcedo and Sutton returned to the Orange County Sheriff's Department. They had spent most of the afternoon talking to people who lived in Jane's condo complex, and while they hadn't talked to everyone, they already had to admit that their hate crime theory was looking sort of like a wash. Most people didn't even know Jane was in a relationship at all, since her girlfriend, Marianne, lived in a different city, so they didn't see her. And also, there was just nothing anybody in the neighborhood said that made the detectives think that Jane was being targeted really for any reason. But a few people had mentioned that recently there had been some burglaries in the complex, which was completely unheard of in a place like Laguna Niguel. Still, there was a huge difference between somebody breaking in and stealing some stuff and breaking in and bludgeoning someone to death. But it was a lead. And that's what Salcedo was thinking about as he and Sutton walked towards their desks. But before they got there, Salcedo had this epiphany. And he just stopped in his tracks and he turned to Sutton and said, "Turn around. We have to go back to the evidence room. I think everything we need to solve this case might be in the building with them right now." The following day, Salcedo and Sutton pulled up in front of a restaurant called the Beach House. The previous afternoon, Salcedo had suggested that he and Sutton go back to the evidence room and listen to Jane's answering machine tapes. Now, to be clear, they had already listened to the tapes before, but none of the messages had seemed particularly important. But now, based on what they'd learned over the course of their investigation, they realized that those messages actually told them a lot. And so Salcedo and Sutton had spent hours re-listening to the tapes and gathering even more evidence to confirm what was on it. And even though they were pretty sure all this evidence they were getting told them who killed Jane, they still needed one more piece to fall into place. Now they had a book of photos with them, and they knew for a fact that one of these photographs was of their killer. And they just needed somebody in this restaurant to verify it. So as soon as they got inside, they found the manager and explained why they were there, and then they asked him, "Hey, would you mind looking at these photos to see if you recognize anyone?" The manager looked a bit alarmed, but he ultimately agreed and said he would. So they went into the back room, they opened up their book of photos, and the manager looked, and pretty much immediately he pointed to one picture. And when Salcedo saw the person the manager was pointing to, he knew they'd cracked the case. Based on forensic evidence and also a confession, here is what investigators believe happened to Jane Thompson in the early morning hours of June 25th, 2004. The killer, clad in dark clothes and gloves, and also holding a hammer, stood in the darkness right outside of Jane's back sliding glass doors. Now, the killer had already been to Jane's house a few times that night, but each time they had come earlier, they had ultimately chickened out and left, because when they would get there, they would look in the back door and they would see Jane asleep on the couch in front of the TV. But that was a problem. They needed Jane to leave the room and go to her bedroom to go sleep in there. But she wasn't doing that. But this time, as they stood outside the glass doors, they knew they had to go in there, or they would never get what they wanted from Jane, even if she was right there on the couch. So the killer took a deep breath and then reached forward and tried to open the back door. And it slid right open, just as they expected. It was unlocked. Once it was open, the killer very carefully, very quietly, stepped inside and made their way over to the couch where Jane was. They wanted to check to make sure Jane was still asleep. But as the killer is hovering over Jane, looking down at her, she's on her back on the couch, the killer practically fainted when Jane opened her eyes and looked right at them. And the killer was so surprised and so scared that they instinctively lifted up their hammer and brought it down on Jane's head. And the blow was so vicious that it sent Jane tumbling down onto the floor, and it also sent blood flying into the air, some of which landed in the killer's mouth. And to the killer, it tasted so bad. And in fact, it infuriated them, this bad taste. It infuriated them so much that it was like their mind just went blank, and they just began slamming her head with the hammer over and over again. And when the killer finally stopped and kind of calmed down for a second, they just stared at Jane's destroyed body in total shock. Then they backed away and realized the hammer, the murder weapon, was dripping blood everywhere. So they grabbed the head of the hammer with their gloved hand to kind of stop it from dripping, and then ran right back out the sliding door. The killer hurried across the street outside, tossing the hammer into the trash as they went. And when they finally got to their home, they stripped off their clothes, balled them up, and then tried to decide where to hide them. And as they thought about that, they looked out their bedroom window at the house across the street, where they'd just killed the one person who had given them a second chance. It would turn out Jane was murdered by a child, her 15-year-old neighbor, Sam Nelson. Sam had actually broken into Jane's house more than once. He'd broken in repeatedly and stolen a lot of things from her, including her credit cards. That was what the phone messages had been about. Jane's credit card company had called her back after she had reported a series of fraudulent charges. And one of those charges was at that restaurant that the investigators visited with the photo lineup. And the manager, when he looked at the photos, recognized Sam, because Sam had been in there recently. The reason Sam was stealing from Jane and also from other people in the neighborhood was ultimately just because he was trying to keep up with his appearance. He used these stolen credit cards and money to buy food and items that would, in his mind, impress his wealthy classmates. On the night of Jane's murder, Sam did not go in there with the intention of killing her. He went in there with the intention of robbing her. But for whatever reason, when, she opened her eyes and saw him, he sort of panicked, hit her once with a hammer, the blood went in his mouth, his mind went blank, and then suddenly he's beating her to death. Sam was arrested and eventually sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for Jane's murder and also for multiple counts of burglary. His earliest eligible release date is in 2027. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In April of 2009, 42-year-old Florida lottery winner Abraham Shakespeare seemed to just disappear off the face of the earth. But a series of text messages from Abraham and a phone call he made to his mother would eventually lead police to make a gruesome discovery about his disappearance. And what they found would expose months of lies and help lead to a groundbreaking new law in Florida. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the Amazon Music follow button that they have a bit of ketchup on their shirt. And then when they look down to see, wind up and uppercut them right in the nose as hard as you can. Okay, let's get into today's story. On April 9th, 2009, 42-year-old Abraham Shakespeare drove his fancy black BMW 750i car towards an upscale gated community in Lakeland, Florida. Abraham stopped his car, hit a remote control on his sun visor, and waited for the large gate that kept his neighborhood separated from the rest of the city to open. Then Abraham drove through the gate and glanced in his rearview mirror. His friend, Dee Dee Moore, was following right behind him in her black Hummer. Abraham led Dee Dee through the neighborhood's winding roads that were dotted with large two-story homes with huge front yards and swimming pools in back. Then he pulled into the driveway of his own house that looked a lot like the others in the neighborhood. Abraham parked his car and stepped outside. He was 6 foot 4 inches tall with long, skinny arms and legs. He had a beard and a black spandex cap that covered his dreadlocks. He wore a white t-shirt and jeans. Dee Dee's huge Hummer pulled into the driveway behind the BMW.
Dee Dee got out and smiled at Abraham. She was 36 years old, and she was tall with dyed blonde hair, and she laughed and talked a lot. Dee Dee went around to the passenger side of the Hummer, opened the door, and took out a video camera and a tripod to put the camera on. She closed the door and then followed Abraham into his house. And Abraham led her through his living room that had high ceilings, large leather couches, and a state-of-the-art TV. The furniture, and most of the decorations inside, had come with the house when Abraham bought it. Abraham asked Dee Dee how her day at work had been as they walked up the staircase to the second floor. And Dee Dee told him that things were going really well. She owned and operated a successful medical staffing agency, and she said business just kept getting better. Then they walked down a hallway on the second floor into a room that Abraham used as an office and as a place to relax and watch TV. And when they walked into the room, Dee Dee set up the tripod, put the camera on it, and turned the camera on. Then she asked Abraham if he was ready for her to film him. Abraham looked at the camera, he grinned and said yep, he was ready. Since Dee Dee's medical staffing agency had taken off, she had spent a lot of time and energy following her dream of becoming a writer. She wanted to write books and movies. And when Dee Dee and Abraham had met through a mutual friend about 6 months earlier, she was fascinated by his life story. And she thought he would be the perfect subject for a biography or a documentary, or maybe even a Hollywood blockbuster movie. Dee Dee pressed record on the camera and asked Abraham just to talk about himself a little bit and to tell her about his life. Dee Dee thought getting Abraham to tell his story in his own words would be a great resource for her for when she started writing a book or movie about him. So Abraham started talking into the camera and pacing a little back and forth, and as he talked about his life, it seemed like he was almost reliving certain moments from when he was younger, and that made Dee Dee smile. And as she listened, she thought even his last name, Shakespeare, was perfect for a storyteller like Abraham. Abraham had grown up poor, and he had dropped out of school when he was about 12 years old to go work in the citrus fields that thrived in that part of Florida. And Abraham had left school without really learning how to read or write beyond the most basic level. And as he got older, he started to understand that his employment options would always be limited. And so he had spent the majority of his life moving from one odd job to another, trying to make ends meet. In the room upstairs in his house, Abraham stopped pacing for a second, and he thought back to some of the low-paying jobs he'd had. And he said going from job to job and struggling to survive had made it clear to him just how much the city of Lakeland was divided. Lakeland was part of the Tampa Bay area, and in Lakeland, some of the wealthiest people in Florida lived just miles away from some of the poorest people. And Abraham said when he was younger, he would pass by the gated communities where the rich people lived, and he would tell himself that someday he would figure out a way to move behind those gates. But it was a dream that most people in his poor neighborhood laughed at, and for most of Abraham's life, that dream he had seemed like it was impossible to achieve. But even though Abraham had spent decades living in his mom's house and working low-paying jobs, he had refused to let that bring him down. And everybody who knew Abraham said he was one of the kindest, most positive people they had ever met. Then, 3 years earlier, on November 15th of 2006, Abraham had been working as a delivery man for a food distribution company. Abraham's coworker, Michael Ford, had been driving the delivery truck that day, and he pulled into a convenience store to get cigarettes and a drink. But before Michael got out of the truck, Abraham had reached into his pocket and taken out $2. Abraham was pretty broke at the time, and he knew he shouldn't just throw money away, but he stared at the dollar bills in his hand and then gave them to Michael and asked him to buy 2 quick pick lottery tickets. And Michael laughed, grabbed the money, and went inside. A few minutes later, Michael had gotten back in the truck and given Abraham the 2 lottery tickets. Then, the following evening, Abraham had been sitting on the couch at his mother's house, watching the winning lottery numbers get announced on the local news. And he had just stared at the TV, stunned, because each winning lottery number that just got announced matched a number on a lottery ticket he was holding. At first, as the numbers kept matching over and over again, Abraham had kind of laughed it off and thought, this is not going to happen. But when they were about to announce the final number, he could feel his heart beating faster, because all he needed was one more match. He leaned in close to the TV and watched as the newscaster called out the final winning lottery number. And when Abraham had heard that number, he checked his ticket, then he checked it again and again, and then Abraham jumped off the couch and started shouting to his mother that he had just won the lottery. Abraham's mom came into the room and she thought he was playing a prank. But when he showed her the numbers on the TV and the matching numbers on his ticket, she started screaming and crying because Abraham had hit the $30 million jackpot. Fast forward back to the present, and Abraham smiled into the camera, and Dee Dee smiled too. Just hearing Abraham tell that story about winning the lottery was like listening to somebody describe a miracle, like something that never really actually happens in real life. But then Abraham stared down at the floor, and a look of total exhaustion came across his face. So Dee Dee asked him if he was okay, and Abraham told Dee Dee about what had happened almost immediately after he was shown on the TV collecting his big lottery winnings. Even after a huge amount of taxes and a reduced payout for taking his lottery money immediately instead of over several years, Abraham walked away with about $12 million, more money than he'd ever imagined having in his whole life. And with that money, Abraham had bought his dream house in one of Lakeland's beautiful gated communities for the rich, and he had gotten himself a very fancy car, that BMW. But soon after that, a lot of people had seemed to take advantage of Abraham's kindness. And he was lending money to friends, family, and people he had never met before, and he was paying for their mortgages, healthcare bills, college tuition fees, startup expenses for businesses, and just about anything else people could think of. And Abraham said that he loved helping people, he really did. But over time, it had just gotten more out of control, and now, 2.5 years after he had won the lottery, he said there were days where he would get hundreds of text messages from people asking for money, and he just felt like he couldn't say no to any of them. In fact, Abraham had a cousin named Cedric Edom who owed him thousands of dollars in mortgage payments on a house that Abraham had bought and let Cedric live in. And now Abraham could barely even get Cedric to talk to him, let alone get Cedric to pay back any of the money he owed. And Abraham hated that he felt like his lottery money was coming between him and his friends and family. From behind the camera, Dee Dee asked Abraham if he was tired, and he turned away from the lens, then glanced back and said he'd been tired for a whole year. And he said sometimes he dreamed of running away to a beach in some other country and just disappearing forever. Not long after that, Dee Dee stopped recording. She could tell Abraham was getting upset, and she felt for him. She hadn't won millions of dollars, but she said when her business had taken off, she had her share of people coming out of the woodwork asking her for money, and she knew that even for someone who was as good of a person as Abraham, that pressure could take its toll. And so Abraham and Dee Dee had talked for a little while longer, but not for the camera. And then at some point, Abraham looked around the room and then stared out the window at his sprawling yard. Abraham lived in a place he'd once dreamed about, and now all he wanted to do was get as far away from that house as possible. And after this day, April 9th, 2009, when Abraham and Dee Dee chatted and Abraham spoke for the camera, Abraham just kind of disappeared. And in the days and weeks following this day, Dee Dee, Abraham's mom, and some of his other close friends and family did get occasional text messages from Abraham, but nobody saw him or talked to him on the phone. And in the text messages he sent, Abraham always said that he was doing fine and he just wanted to be left alone, but he never said where he actually was. And so Abraham's apparent decision to just leave without telling anyone really upset his mom. They had always been really close, and she had talked to Abraham almost every day for his entire life. So now only getting a few text messages from him every now and again with kind of sparse information about what he was doing and where he was very difficult for her to deal with. But like Dee Dee, Abraham's mom had seen up close how people constantly came to Abraham for money and how that really weighed on him. And she knew Abraham had started to imagine himself walking on a beach where nobody knew who he was and where nobody would bother him. And so Abraham's mom and his other family and friends didn't try to find him. They just kind of respected that he really just wanted space. But then, fast forward to November 9th, 2009, 7 months after Abraham was last seen by anybody close to him. And on that day, Detective Dave Clark of the Polk County Sheriff's Department was sitting at his desk looking at a report that didn't make sense to him. The Sheriff's Department had gotten a call from Cedric Edom, Abraham's cousin who owed him thousands of dollars. And Cedric had said that his cousin had been missing since April, and he wanted to file an official missing persons report. Detective Clark, who had short blonde hair and a goatee, looked really young, but in reality, he had been in law enforcement for years, and he had experience with almost every kind of case. And Clark had a reputation for being one of the best listeners and one of the most objective officers in the entire department.
In fact, during interrogations, Clark was known to give suspects every chance to tell their side of a story because he genuinely believed in the assumption that people were innocent until proven guilty. But as much as Clark had seen over the years, and as much as he tried to give people the benefit of the doubt, something about this missing persons report felt really strange to him. If this man was missing, why had his friends and family waited 7 months to tell the police? Clark leaned back in his chair and read over the report again. And this time, when he read the missing person's name, his eyes went wide. He grabbed a piece of paper and pen and started writing down some notes. Because Clark remembered something that he hadn't thought of in years. Clark knew who Abraham Shakespeare was, because after Abraham had hit the lottery jackpot back in 2006, news stations in the area covered what they called Abraham's rags to riches story over and over for weeks. So Clark now knew he was dealing with a potentially missing person who was worth millions and millions of dollars. And when that much money was involved, there was always the possibility of foul play. And so Clark wanted to get to work on this case right away, and he wanted to start his investigation with the man who had filed the missing persons report, because Clark was interested in finding out why, after all this time, Cedric had now decided to come forward and track down his cousin. A few hours later, Detective Clark led Abraham's cousin, Cedric, into an interrogation room at the sheriff's department, and Cedric was combative almost from the moment he walked in. He told Clark he didn't understand why he was being questioned, and he said he was the only one who seemed concerned at all about Abraham. But Clark just smiled and asked Cedric to sit down with him at a small table in the cramped, bright room. And then Clark said that they had contacted Cedric and asked him to come in because he was the one who had contacted them. And the police really just wanted to know what was going on with Abraham that had concerned Cedric enough to get in touch with authorities. Cedric took a breath and tried to calm down, but it didn't work. And in a very angry voice, he launched into an attack against a bunch of Abraham's friends, including Dee Moore, and he said they were all really greedy people who took advantage of Abraham. And then Cedric said he was almost positive that one of them had killed Abraham and taken off with his money. Clark listened and let Cedric talk for as long as he wanted, and Clark thought it was a little weird how quickly Cedric had jumped to the conclusion that Abraham had been murdered, but Clark didn't mention that. And when Cedric finally stopped talking, Clark smiled and talked to Cedric almost like they'd been friends for years. Clark said he'd done some research right after getting the missing persons report, and so he knew that Cedric owed Abraham thousands of dollars in mortgage payments on a house that Abraham had bought for him. Cedric shook his head, and the anger in his voice came right back, and he said he loved his cousin, and he reiterated that he was the only one doing anything to find him. By the end of the interview, Clark was even more surprised than he had been by the missing persons report. He didn't have enough evidence to hold Cedric, but he thought if something really had happened to Abraham, Cedric had to be at the top of the suspect list. Here was a guy who hadn't said anything for 7 months, who owed Abraham thousands of dollars, talked about a potential murder, and then immediately tried to put the blame on other people. So Clark couldn't shake the feeling that Cedric might have contacted police in an attempt to cover his own tracks in some way. But Clark was going to remain objective like he always did, and even if he was potentially connected to Abraham's disappearance, there was also a chance that he was telling the truth. And so maybe there really were friends of Abraham who were out to get his money in any way possible. So later that day, the sheriff's department subpoenaed the cell phone company in order to get a detailed account of Abraham's cell phone records. But Clark knew that could take a while, so he dug further into some of Abraham's financial records, and the list of people who owed him money was astonishing. In the 3 years since Abraham won the lottery, he had loaned millions of dollars to people. And this was just in the form of property expenses, medical bills, educational costs, and other loans that had a clear paper trail. But Clark figured Abraham must have also been handing out money to people in his everyday life that he had not kept records of. So tracking down all the people who owed Abraham money would take time and resources. Clark was willing to do whatever it took, but he still had no evidence, other than Cedric's word, that Abraham was actually missing. Clark needed to get a better idea of what was happening. So he decided to talk directly to one of the people that Cedric had been eager to blame for Abraham's disappearance, Dee Moore. On November 10th, the day after the missing persons report had been filed, Detective Clark found himself back in the interrogation room. This time, he was seated across the table from Dee Dee Moore, Abraham's friend who wanted to write a book and make a movie about his life. Dee Dee had on jeans, a t-shirt, and leather sandals, and Clark thought she was almost the exact opposite of Cedric when it came to interviewing her. She smiled a bunch and seemed very easygoing, and she said she would tell him anything she could, but that she didn't really understand why she was there. So Clark asked her, when was the last time you spoke to Abraham? And she said she had gotten a text from him somewhat recently, and that he messaged her from time to time just to see how things were going in her life and to tell her that he was okay and enjoying his time away. Then Clark took a breath and got a serious look on his face. He looked right at Dee Dee and told her that Abraham's cousin, Cedric, had said he was worried Abraham might be dead. Dee Dee immediately looked confused and said she didn't understand because as far as she knew, she was texting somewhat regularly with Abraham. And as far as she knew, Abraham had done exactly what he said he was going to do. Take off to maybe a beach somewhere and never look back. So Clark asked her why Cedric would have filed the missing persons report in the first place and why he might have pointed the finger at her as someone who might have wanted to hurt Abraham. Dee Dee just shook her head, and then she looked at Clark and said she had an idea why Cedric might come after her. Clark smiled, and in his friendly voice, he asked Dee Dee to fill him in. And Dee Dee said that she and Abraham's mom were two of the only people in his life who had pushed Abraham to follow up with everyone who owed him money and make them pay him back. They said it was one thing to be a kind person, but it was another to get taken advantage of. And they told Abraham that just because someone was family, it didn't mean they were entitled to get anything they wanted from him. Clark nodded and asked if that had caused problems in Abraham's life, having people like Cedric around. And Dee Dee's voice got a little louder and rougher, and she said Cedric preyed on good-hearted people. And she knew that as much as Abraham wanted to see the best in others, Cedric would never pay him back a dime. Detective Clark and Dee Dee spoke for a little while longer, and then Clark thanked her for her time, and after she left, he went back to his desk to look at his notes from both of the interviews he'd conducted over the past couple of days. And as he did that, all he could think about was how badly he wanted to see Abraham's cell phone records. Because Clark still didn't know if Abraham was dead in a ditch somewhere like Cedric wanted him to believe, or if Abraham was just sipping pina coladas on a beach without a care in the world. In the days following his interview with Dee Dee, Clark kept digging into Abraham's financial records, and he and other members of the investigative team met with Abraham's friends, family, and as many people who owed him money as possible. But Clark also discovered something new that caught his interest. Michael Ford, Abraham's co-worker who had used Abraham's money to buy the winning lottery tickets, had filed a lawsuit about a year after Abraham had won the lottery. In that lawsuit, Michael had argued that because he was the one who actually bought the tickets for Abraham, he was entitled to at least a cut of the winnings. But Michael had lost his case in court, and Clark wanted to know if maybe Michael held a grudge against Abraham. So Clark pursued this new potential lead. But he discovered that Michael and Abraham had pretty much lost touch once the trial started, and Abraham had even stated publicly that he didn't blame Michael for doing what he did. And he said he would have been willing to give Michael hundreds of thousands of dollars if Michael had just asked him, instead of going directly to the courts. Now, none of this ruled out Michael as a suspect in Clark's mind, but there was no evidence putting Michael anywhere near Abraham in the days and weeks before Abraham had apparently disappeared. So Clark knew he needed to keep looking elsewhere. And Clark still felt like he was in the middle of one of the most bizarre cases he'd ever dealt with, because no evidence had surfaced that suggested anything violent or against the law had even happened to Abraham. There was no body, there was no signs of distress at his house, and friends and family kept getting text messages from him. So Clark kept reminding himself that Abraham was a guy with the financial means to truly just disappear if he wanted to. But then, at the end of the month, something happened that would turn Detective Clark's attention back to one suspect in particular. On a day in late November, Abraham's mom contacted Detective Clark and said she had something to show him. So Clark drove out to her house, and Abraham's mom met him at the door and invited him inside. The house was warm and comfortable, and being there, Clark felt even more of an urge to discover where Abraham was, just so he could put Abraham's mom's mind at ease. Clark thanked Abraham's mom for calling him and for welcoming him into her house. Then she led him into the living room and picked up an envelope from the coffee table. She opened it and showed Clark a greeting card with a Christian cross on the front. and she said when she'd gotten this card, there had been a $100 bill inside of it. She handed the card to Clark and he opened it, and he saw a scribbled note that said, "I'll be home soon," and Abraham's signature underneath. And Abraham's mom said that even though her son had trouble writing, he had always made sure he could sign his name, and she recognized that was definitely his signature on the card. Abraham's mom told Clark that she had gotten the letter about 2 months earlier, but she had forgotten about it. She said she was sorry she had not shown it to him sooner. Clark said that was totally fine, and that he was grateful that she was showing it to him now. And he picked up the envelope that the card had come in, and he squinted his eyes, almost like he was trying to look for something that wasn't there, because there was no stamp or address on the envelope, and it didn't look like it had been mailed from anywhere. So Clark asked Abraham's mom how she'd actually gotten the letter, and she told him her nephew, Abraham's cousin, Cedric, had hand-delivered it. Just hearing that made Clark feel like his investigation had gone right back to where it started. Then, without Clark saying anything, Abraham's mom said that even though Cedric was her nephew, she didn't always trust him. And she didn't necessarily believe he was just trying to do right by Abraham by filing the missing persons report. And then she looked Clark in the eyes and told him all she really wanted was to hear from her son. If she could just hear his voice, she would know he was okay and everything would be fine. Clark said he understood, and he thanked Abraham's mom for all her help and told her he would keep her informed if he learned anything new. Then Clark went back to the station and he told other members of the investigative team that he wanted to keep looking into Abraham's cousin, Cedric, because giving Abraham's mom a card with $100 and Abraham's signature in it seemed like one more way Cedric could be trying to cover something up. And then Clark got some information that he was confident would break the case wide open. The phone company had come back and they provided police with a detailed history of text messages sent from Abraham's number. And something in those text messages stood out to Clark right away. And by December, Clark believed he was closer than ever to finding Abraham. On December 26, 2009, so a month and a half after the missing persons report was filed, Abraham's mother was relaxing on the couch at her house. Christmas had been a mixed blessing that year. She loved seeing friends and family for the holidays, but not having Abraham around just hadn't felt right. They had always spent Christmas together, and so the house kind of felt empty without him. But then her phone rang. She leaned over, grabbed it off the coffee table, and almost started crying tears of joy, because Abraham was calling. The connection wasn't great, but she could hear her son on the other line, and that was all that mattered. Abraham wished her a Merry Christmas and said he was sorry he hadn't called the day before. And Abraham's mom said that was okay, and that she just wanted to know how he was doing. And he said, other than dealing with a little winter cold, he'd been great. And he knew him leaving had been very hard on people, especially her, but he felt like he'd made the right choice. And he promised he'd be home soon, and when he did, he'd be much happier than when he left. Abraham's mom hung up the phone, and she felt better than she had in months. And she wanted to call everyone she knew to let them know the good news. She had finally heard from Abraham. She had heard his voice. But first, she thought she needed to tell the police. So she took a deep breath, collected herself, and called the sheriff's department. On December 26th, right after Abraham's mom had gotten this call from her son, Detective Clark was sitting at his desk. His phone rang, and he picked it up, and he could hear Abraham's mom almost shouting at him on the other line. She told him about the phone call she'd just received from Abraham and how happy she was, and so Clark thanked her for letting him know, he wished her a Merry Christmas, and then hung up. But then, he immediately made a call to the cell phone company so he could get a location on where Abraham's phone had been when he placed this call to his mother. And when Clark heard what they had to say, he shouted across the room to a fellow detective and told him they needed to leave immediately. Clark and this other detective ran out of the station. They climbed into an unmarked car, Clark sat in the passenger seat and the other detective drove, and before long they were peeling out of the parking lot and heading onto the street. It was a mild winter day in Florida, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, but the sun was bright and Clark could feel himself sweating a little from the adrenaline rush. Minutes later, they pulled off the road and into a parking lot of a huge shopping mall. And when they arrived, Clark and the other detective saw the man they were looking for sitting in a parked car nearby. But before the detectives could get out of their car, the man they were looking for drove off. And so Clark looked over at the other detective and just said, "Chase him." So the detective peeled out of the mall parking lot and raced down the street after this man in the car. But the detectives realized they didn't have police sirens in their unmarked vehicle, so they couldn't signal to the driver that they were cops and they wanted to pull him over. So the detective just tried to stay as close to the man they were chasing as possible. Then finally they came to a red light and the man they were after stopped. And so without even thinking, Detective Clark threw open his door, he ran in front of this car, he held up his badge, and he yelled at the driver to get out and come with them. The man in this car just stared up at Clark, and then he slumped his shoulders and put his head down. And later that day, after they had all talked back at the sheriff's station, Detective Clark knew where Abraham Shakespeare had been all this time. Based on interviews and cell phone data collected throughout the missing persons investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on April 9th, 2009, when Abraham first disappeared. On that night, Abraham drove his car down a road in an upscale neighborhood in a town about 20 minutes away from his house in Lakeland. Abraham had spent much of the day talking to Dee Dee on camera, and he was still thinking about getting away from Florida and kind of dropping off the map for a while. But before he did anything drastic, he wanted to make sure he had enough cash on hand to just disappear. And he hoped to avoid leaving a paper trail as much as possible, so it would be harder for people to track him down. So Abraham was on his way to the house of someone who owed him money and who had told Abraham that they had thousands of dollars in cash that they could give him. While Abraham wound his way through the neighborhood, the person he was going to see sat inside their house and waited for Abraham to arrive. And a few minutes later, they saw the headlights from Abraham's BMW outside. So they went to the front door, stood in the doorway, and waved to Abraham as he stepped out of his car. When Abraham got to the door, the person he was meeting with could tell that Abraham seemed down. But they said hopefully getting some cash would cheer him up. Abraham smiled and walked inside and followed this person through their living room and into a small home office. Abraham stood in the middle of the office, and the person he was meeting with walked across the room to a floor safe standing in the corner. Then that person crouched down, they entered the combination for the lock and opened the safe. And then they just waited there for a second. Abraham asked if everything was okay, and this person said, "Yep, everything's fine. I just need to make sure I grab the right amount of money." Then this person reached into the safe, slowly stood up, turned around, and aimed a gun right at Abraham. A look of fear came across Abraham's face, but before he could turn to run, the person shot him right in the chest, and blood began to stain his white t-shirt. Then the person fired again, and this bullet grazed Abraham's heart and perforated his lung. The shooter casually walked across the room and stood over Abraham, and they watched and listened as Abraham slowly died. Then the killer put the gun back in the safe. Then they went back to Abraham's body, crouched down, took his phone out of his pocket, and slipped it into their own pocket. Then they grabbed Abraham's legs and dragged him out of the room. Abraham was skinny, but he was very tall, so dragging him through the house was not easy. But eventually they managed to pull Abraham to the back door, and then they dragged him out into the backyard. A fence surrounded the yard, and it was totally dark out there except for some moonlight. So the killer did not feel like anyone could see them, so they didn't rush. They bent over, caught their breath, and then picked up a shovel that was laying in the grass. Then they started digging a hole in the middle of the yard. Finally, when the hole was deep enough, they walked over to Abraham's body, grabbed him by the legs, dragged him across the yard, and dumped him into the hole. Then they took the shovel and filled the hole back in. Later that night, they cleaned the bloodstains from inside their house and out in the yard, and then they found a phone number of a construction company that they planned to call the next day to place a concrete slab over the hole where they had just buried Abraham. Then the killer went into the living room, hooked up their video camera to the television, and watched the recording they had made with Abraham earlier that day. Dee Dee Moore, Abraham's friend who was an aspiring writer, had murdered Abraham. It turned out that months before the murder, she had convinced Abraham to give her control of his finances, and she had promised to play the bad guy and collect money from all of Abraham's friends and family who owed him. And she even agreed to hold on to a large amount of Abraham's cash for him in her safe so he wouldn't be tempted to just hand it out to people who asked him for money. And because Dee Dee was a successful business owner, Abraham had believed she would be better at managing money and collecting debts than he could ever be. So he thanked Dee Dee for her help and put her in charge of millions of dollars in cash and assets. and Dee Dee had collected money from people who owed Abraham, but instead of giving the money to Abraham, she kept it for herself. And she spent that money and some of the cash Abraham had given her on a brand new huge Hummer vehicle and other expensive items she wanted. And for months, Dee Dee had gotten away with it without anyone suspecting anything. But then, in the spring of 2009, not long before the murder, one of Abraham's friends started to catch on to what Dee Dee was doing. Because even though he was making regular payments to Dee Dee to clear his debts with Abraham, she kept asking him for more money. And when he got angry and said he had already paid what he owed, Dee Dee worried he would tell Abraham, and Abraham would find out that she had been stealing his money. So Dee Dee decided she would just get rid of Abraham, but keep collecting the money people owed him for herself. But in order to do that, she had to make it seem like Abraham was alive and just wanted his distance. And so when she filmed him on her camera, claiming it was for her book and movie, even though in reality she had no aspirations to write Abraham's story, she intentionally steered the conversation to how tired and frustrated he must be. And when Abraham talked about wanting to escape to a foreign beach, Dee Dee knew it was time to put her plan into motion. So she told Abraham to come to her house to get thousands of dollars in cash that she'd been holding for him in her safe, and when he arrived, she killed him and then used his phone to text his friends and family, and then she showed some of his friends and family the video recording of Abraham where he was talking about how he wanted to leave Florida and go to a beach somewhere and just kind of disappear and be left alone. And so naturally, his friends and family believed that that was what happened to Abraham. He had chosen to kind of go away. And Dee Dee almost got away with it. But once Abraham was dead, Dee Dee became relentless in her pursuit of his cousin Cedric, and she called Cedric and came to his house all the time, demanding he pay back all of the money he owed Abraham, and Cedric just wasn't going to do that. And so finally, Cedric got fed up with Dee Dee, and he filed a missing persons report. Now, Cedric did not actually believe that Abraham was dead, but by alleging that he had been murdered and pointing at Dee Dee as potentially the murderer, he knew that would launch a police investigation into Dee Dee, and that would get her off of his back for at least a while. And when Detective Clark got a record of Abraham's text messages, he was shocked at how well written and how formal they were. After all, he knew that Abraham still struggled with reading and writing. Then, when Abraham supposedly called his mother on the day after Christmas, Detective Clark got confirmation that what he believed had been going on was going on. Somebody in town had been using Abraham's phone and had been pretending to be him. And when Clark traced Abraham's phone to the mall parking lot, he and the other detective saw Dee Dee leaning into a car, handing over cash to a man and taking a phone back from him. And when they chased that man down, he admitted that he was a friend of Abraham's who Dee Dee had paid to call Abraham's mom and pretend to be Abraham. And the man had told Abraham's mom on this call that he was fighting a winter cold to make up for the fact that he didn't really sound like Abraham. Not long after that, Abraham's cousin Cedric came back to the sheriff's station, and he admitted that someone had paid him to deliver the greeting card that Abraham supposedly wrote to his mother. And it would turn out that the money Cedric was paid to make that delivery could be traced back to Dee Dee. And so Cedric had been right about Dee Dee all along without actually knowing it. With all of this new information, and with Abraham's phone records, police determined that every text message that had been sent from Abraham's phone since he disappeared had actually been sent by Dee Dee. And eventually, they learned that Dee Dee had hired a construction company to lay a concrete slab down in her backyard. So, on January 27, 2010, over 9 months after Abraham's murder, police went to Dee Dee's house, and they broke up the concrete slab out back, dug up the ground underneath, and found the skeletal remains of Abraham Shakespeare. And pieces of the t-shirt and jeans that Abraham had been wearing in the video that Dee Dee recorded on the day she killed him were still clinging to his bones. Dee Dee was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Abraham was given a proper burial, and his family was finally able to grieve. And his murder helped lead to a new Florida law that keeps the identities of large jackpot lottery winners private for 90 days. And in a telephone interview from prison, Dee Dee surprised reporters and said she strongly supported this new law.
So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not on the podcast. They're only on YouTube. Again, that channel is called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of July 11th, 2009, an elderly woman grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down at her kitchen table in Pensacola, Florida, to read the local paper. The news was a big part of her day. She had lived in her neighborhood for 60 years, and she liked keeping tabs on everything going on in her community, which was actually usually a lot. Pensacola and the surrounding county had some of the highest crime rates in Florida, and so crimes were always making the news. And so she was not surprised when she opened the paper that morning and saw a police bulletin about a homicide in the area. The bulletin was asking residents of Pensacola to be on the lookout for a specific red van. And when this woman saw the grainy photo of the vehicle, she gasped and almost knocked over her coffee because she'd seen that van and she knew exactly who it belonged to. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, on the next hot day, offer the follow button a strawberry popsicle. But don't tell them it's actually just frozen hot sauce. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just after 5 a.m. on July 9th, 2009, 67-year-old Bud Billings poured some cereal into a bowl and then passed it to his 11-year-old daughter. Then he grabbed another empty bowl, filled that one with cereal too, and passed it to his 10-year-old son. This was Bud's favorite part of the day. It was like a cereal assembly line that he did with his kids every morning while blaring country music from a nearby stereo. It was really the only way to get breakfast on the table, because Bud had a huge family. He and his 43-year-old wife, Melanie, had 9 children, all under the age of 11 years old, who lived in the house with them. And all of them had special needs. Now, it hadn't always been that way, though. Bud and Melanie had gotten married 16 years earlier, and at the time, they'd had Bud's adopted son, Justin, and Melanie's 2 girls, Ashley and Nikki. And at that time, it was actually just Nikki who had special needs, and she required a lot of extra care. She had autism, cerebral palsy, and epilepsy. And unfortunately, just last year, she had died from a stroke, which had been completely devastating for the whole family. But, looking after her and caring for Nikki had really made Bud and Melanie want to take care of other kids with special needs too. Which was why, about 10 years ago, they had actually intentionally begun adopting children like Nikki. And once they started doing that, they felt so fulfilled and so happy about it that it had been really hard to stop. Bud looked over to where the rest of his kids were gathered around the table eating cereal. And it seemed like a lot, and sometimes it felt like a lot, but Bud loved his big, chaotic family and was really proud he was able to give these kids a home. And he made a good living as an entrepreneur and business owner, to the point where he'd actually been able to build this entire huge house for his kids. It had 9 bedrooms, so everybody could spread out and have their own space. And outside, they had a big fenced-in area with a whole setup, a slide, a swing, big trampoline. Now, the home was technically on the highway, but the driveway was so long, they couldn't even hear the cars. Plus, the town of Beulah, Florida, where they lived, was really remote anyway, and there weren't a lot of people around to even be driving on the highway. All that's to say, this big old house on the highway felt more like their own personal little fortress, especially when you consider the fact that Bud had an extensive surveillance system. He had a bunch of cameras inside and around the property to keep an eye on all the kids and make sure everybody was accounted for. And so Bud filled up the last cereal bowl and went over to the table, where his wife, Melanie, was busy breaking up a fight between their 2 youngest. Bud watched her very calmly end the argument without ever raising her voice, which was sort of typical of Mel. She was the most patient person he had ever met.
As Bud sat down at the table, the phone rang, and Melanie got up to get it. Bud could hear the happiness in his wife's voice as she answered, so he guessed it had to be Ashley. Melanie's oldest daughter, Ashley, was 26 now, but she still called home at least a few times a day. Which, Bud didn't mind, but it did sort of make him a bit jealous. He wished he was as close with his older son, Justin, as his wife was with Ashley. He'd adopted Justin when he was just a baby, and he was 20 now, and so he'd basically had him his whole life. But for some reason, Justin, ever since dropping out of college last winter, really didn't seem interested in spending any time with his dad. Bud guessed it was just because he was embarrassed, or maybe there were some growing pains that came with adulthood, but it was still tough to feel that distance with his son. Just then, Melanie suddenly handed Bud the phone and told him that Ashley had a question for him, and Bud could guess what this was about. He owned an auto business and financing center, and Ashley had taken it over a few years ago so that Bud could slow down and spend more time with the kids. But he still helped her with problems as they came up. So Bud took the phone and asked her what was up, and sure enough, it was an issue about the business. And so Bud listened carefully as she described some billing issue that he did have an easy fix for, and then after they were done, they hung up and they both went about their day. Later that day, around 4 p.m., Bud went upstairs to his home office. The summer heat had finally broken, so he had spent most of the day outside with his kids. But their 37-year-old neighbor, April Spencer, was now downstairs helping Melanie out with all the kids, which meant Bud could finally break away and go get some work done. Even though Bud was basically retired, he'd been an entrepreneur all his life, and it felt sort of unnatural to completely stop working. So he'd sort of started a side hustle, financing used car lots. He also invested in other businesses, but he was picky about who he got involved with. Recently, he was approached about investing in a local karate company, but he had to back out because he wasn't really sure it could be profitable. Plus, the owner, Patrick Gonzalez, was friends with a man whose name was Cab Tice, and Bud hated Cab Tice. Now, Bud was a nice guy with a very clear soft spot for kids, but when it came to business, he never let people get the best of him. And Cab Tice had tried. Bud and Cab used to be partners, but then Cab had stolen a bunch of money from Bud. And the way Bud had handled it was to basically confront Cab almost every day, calling him all the time and demanding he pay him back. And so, on this particular afternoon, Bud decided he would call Cab again and demand his money again. So he dialed Cab's number, and he let it ring until it went to voicemail, which was not a surprise because Cab really never answered. Bud decided not to leave a message. Instead, he just hung up and made a few more calls to some associates at his car lots. It was around 5 p.m. when Bud went back downstairs to find his wife Melanie and his neighbor April in the kitchen, making some mac and cheese for the kids' dinner. April actually lived on their property in a trailer and was basically part of their family. Melanie and Bud had known her for 10 years at this point. She was also a registered nurse, so she was a huge help with their kids, who all basically had health issues. When Bud got down there, he thanked April and told her she could head back home now. He was ready to step back in. So they all said their goodbyes, and then the next 2 hours were just a blur of bath time and bedtime. Then it was lights out for the kids right at 7 p.m. Once the kids were in bed, Melanie went to clean up the kitchen, while Bud settled down in the living room and turned on the TV. And as he sank into the couch, he let himself feel the exhaustion of the day. He loved his life, and he was ready to do this all over again tomorrow. But still, he was tired. As Bud sat there on the couch, he began to doze off. However, his eyes shot right back open again when he heard a loud bang come from the front door. Instinctively, he leapt up, having no idea what was happening, but all he could hear were these loud, pounding footsteps charging through the house, headed straight towards him. 20 minutes later, around 7:30 p.m., Bud and Melanie's neighbor, April Spencer, made dinner in her trailer and got ready to relax for the night. And she'd just taken a plate out of her microwave when she heard a child's voice outside yelling. April was more confused than alarmed. I mean, it was typical to hear the kids next door, but usually, at this point, they were all in bed, asleep. And then before she could investigate, someone started banging on her trailer door and screaming for help. April rushed over and swung it open to see the Billings' 11-year-old daughter standing on her trailer steps, sobbing. She then mumbled through panicked tears that something bad had happened in her house. Seconds later, April sprinted towards the Billings home, which was only a short distance from her trailer. And when she got there, the front door was already open. She hurried inside to find the house very still and quiet, except for the sound of someone sobbing upstairs. She could tell it was one of the kids, and immediately she called up to them that everything was okay, she was here. But then April saw something that made her stop mid-sentence. On the floor of the hallway, just outside the living room, was a trail of blood. April gasped and started to panic when she realized the trail led to Bud and Melanie's first-floor bedroom, but she forced herself to slowly follow the blood and push open that bedroom door. And when she saw what was inside, she had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. She staggered backwards away from the room, then ran to call 911. Within the hour, at least 6 police units and a team of crime technicians were at the Billings' home, documenting the horrific scene and collecting evidence. Deputy Robert Guy climbed out of his cruiser in front of the house. So far, he'd been told that the homeowners, Bud and Melanie Billings, had been found shot to death inside of their bedroom. And before even stepping 1 foot inside of this house, Guy already had a theory. So he had been with the Escambia County Sheriff's Department for 6 years, and in his experience, when a couple was found dead at their home, it was always a murder-suicide. But even if that was what happened here, Guy had never worked a case like this before, because he'd also been told that 9 young children lived inside of this home, and they were actually in the house during this shooting. They had all been found hiding around the house during the initial police sweep, and they were now standing outside by a police cruiser wrapped up in blankets. There was an adult woman standing with them, and Guy could see that all of them, the woman included, were either sobbing or staring off into space, clearly in shock. Guy felt this wave of sympathy come over him. These kids were too young to go through something like this, and so the more time he could give them to process, the better. So instead of speaking to them first and forcing them to sort of confront what had just happened, he decided his first move would just be to go into the crime scene and have a look around. Guy headed towards the house and entered through the front door. And the first thing he noticed was there was a big boot print on the wood of the door, and the sides of the door were all splintered. This door clearly had been kicked open. And so seeing that told Guy that his murder-suicide theory likely couldn't be true. Someone else had forced their way into this home and committed this crime. Guy asked a tech to take a photo of the door. Then he went inside to do an initial walkthrough of the first floor. There was some blood in the front hallway, and even more of it soaked into the living room carpet, where there was also a bullet hole in the floor. So at least part of this attack must have happened here. Guy then headed to the primary bedroom where he'd been told the bodies were. And the first thing he noticed in there was that there was a lot of blood soaking into the carpet, and there were also a bunch of shell casings on the ground. Bud's body lay at the foot of the bed face down, and when Guy approached, he could see that Bud had been shot multiple times, including at least once in the head, and he also had a zip tie on his left wrist. And so clearly, at some point, the killer must have tried to restrain him. Melanie was by the closet on her back, and also she had gunshot wounds in her head and chest, and she did not have any restraints on. And so she had either cooperated with the killer or was just shot first. After looking at Melanie, Guy's eyes moved over to the closet right nearby, and it was wide open. And he saw inside the closet, there was a very clear square impression in the carpet on the floor. It looked like something very big and heavy had been removed from that spot, possibly by the killer. And so this gave Guy a new theory. If something had been stolen from this room, that suggested this was a robbery, and maybe Melanie and Bud had just gotten in the way. So Guy left the bedroom to do a full walkthrough of the whole house, including the upstairs, with this theory in mind. However, he didn't actually see anything else that pointed to a looting or a robbery. Big-ticket electronics and jewelry were still in the house, and so was a safe that was upstairs. Which of course could mean his new theory that this was a robbery was wrong. Or it could mean this was a robbery, but the robber had only been looking for something specific that they knew was in this house. Like, for example, whatever that heavy square object was that had been at some point sitting in the closet in the bedroom that left that impression in the carpet. He really wanted to know what had been in there. So he figured now was the time to go outside and actually speak to the kids. Moments later, Guy was standing with the Billings kids and the woman who was standing with them. The woman said her name was April and that she was the one who called 911. As April spoke to Guy, she kept glancing over his shoulder at the kids to make sure they were okay. And Guy did too, because even though he wanted to speak to these kids, he knew he had to tread very carefully. Not only were these kids likely very traumatized, but anytime law enforcement interviewed young kids, it had to be done with precautions, like with a specialist or trusted adult. So for right now, he was just starting with April. Her voice shook as she explained how one of the Billings' daughters had come to her trailer, and then also what she had actually seen when she went inside their home. April said she lived on the property, but she hadn't seen or heard anything strange before going over there. April also told Guy that she looked after the Billings kids a lot, and that they actually had two other older kids, Ashley and Justin, who did not live in the house with them. And so she gave Guy their numbers and said somebody was going to have to call them and let them know what happened. Guy immediately headed over to some officers and asked one of them to get in touch with Ashley and Justin, not only just to notify them, because that was obviously necessary, but also because these two likely could have critical information about this case. And in a domestic murder like this one, loved ones were always the first people Guy looked at as potential suspects. Just then, Guy turned and saw a flash of headlights coming down the driveway, and soon a car pulled up and a young couple jumped out. The woman was frantic and headed right for the kids. When some officers tried to stop her, she shouted that her name was Ashley and those were her siblings. Guy rushed over, and she said again to him who she was, and also that the man she was with was her husband, whose name was Blue. Then she breathlessly explained why she was there. She called the home earlier, and the kids answered, screaming that Mom and Dad were shot. She had been the one who told them to go to April's. She had also called her brother, Justin, who was on his way too. But she said she still didn't know. Were her parents okay? Had they really been shot? As gently as he could, Guy told her what happened, and he watched as Ashley collapsed in Blue's arms. A few minutes later, after Ashley had hugged the kids and calmed down enough to speak, Guy pulled her aside to ask her a few questions. She was still having a hard time catching her breath by this point, but she managed to explain their family situation. Melanie was her mom, and Bud was Justin's dad, and the other kids were their adopted siblings who were adopted by Melanie and Bud. And so Guy let Ashley talk about her parents and her siblings for a few minutes, and then at some point, he asked her the question that had been bothering him. Did Melanie or Bud keep anything valuable in their bedroom closet? Ashley looked confused, and then said, her parents had a safe in there, but inside of it was just documents and some sentimental pieces of jewelry, nothing financially valuable. She said they did have another safe that was upstairs, and that one had a lot of cash in it, maybe around like $200,000. Guy hurried to write this down, and as he did, it just didn't make any sense to him that this killer potentially had taken a safe from the first floor that had nothing valuable inside of it, but then left the safe upstairs that potentially was full of money. But Guy wasn't really confused. It was more like he was excited, because now he was thinking the killer must have inadvertently taken the wrong safe. And so if this was true, it meant that whoever did this knew enough about this family to know that Bud and Melanie did have a safe. But the killer apparently didn't know enough to know that there were actually two safes in the house, one with money and one without. So very likely this meant the killer was, somewhat close to the family, but not that close, which made it unlikely that Ashley and her husband Blue, Ashley's brother Justin, and even April the neighbor were suspects. However, before Guy was going to eliminate anyone, he really needed to speak to the kids. So he asked Ashley if she would help him do that. About a half an hour later, Guy watched as Ashley and Blue coordinated with April to bring the kids away from the scene over to Ashley and Blue's place. By this point, neighbors had gathered outside and everybody was just standing there watching the scene in total shock. It had proven to be very difficult speaking to the kids because they were kids and they were terrified, and many of them had disabilities, which also made it difficult for them to speak. However, during his conversation with the kids, Guy had been able to learn one huge thing. One of the girls happened to look out the window right before the murders and saw a red car parked outside. Now, she wasn't able to give Guy much of a description of this car other than the color and that it was a bigger car, like an SUV. But a large red car was distinct, and Guy had already asked some officers to put out a message to patrols to keep an eye out for it. He also had officers speaking to the neighbors, but the Billings lived on a pretty remote patch of land, so he doubted anybody had seen or heard anything because they just lived too far away. And so Guy had just decided to wrap things up for the night when he saw another set of headlights appear from down the driveway. Seconds later, a car pulled up, and a young man got out, and then he hurried toward the house. An officer stopped him, and Guy could see that at that point the man began to look around and then jogged over to Ashley and the kids. Ashley gave this young man a big hug, and then she began to cry into his shoulder. Guy guessed this young man had to be Justin, Bud's older son, who Ashley had said would be coming. But even though he was only a few feet away, Guy thought there was just something off about him. He didn't appear to be shocked or even really upset at all. He's just arrived at a crime scene where his parents had been shot to death, and he seemed sort of unfazed. But actually, less than being unfazed, it was more like he was sort of nervous. He kept furtively looking over at the police and then the home and sort of fidgeting a little bit. Now, like Ashley, Justin was very likely quite familiar with this house, and also the location of the safes and what was in them, and certainly might not have needed to force entry if he was going to come in here and rob the place. But Guy just had a feeling that something was up, and so he went to speak to him. And as he took the few steps over to Justin, Guy saw Ashley suddenly push herself away from Justin with what appeared to be a very urgent look on her face. When Guy reached the group, Ashley was just shaking her head almost incredulously, saying out loud that she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of that. Then Justin turned to Guy and said, "Has anybody checked the cameras?" Guy froze and asked what he was talking about. Justin told him that their father had cameras in basically every room, and he knew where the recordings were kept. Guy couldn't believe that nobody had noticed these cameras all around the property this whole time. But regardless, if they were there and were as extensive as Justin claimed they were, this was huge. And also, offering up this information suddenly made Justin's behavior seem a whole lot less suspicious. If Justin was on those cameras, he certainly wouldn't have mentioned them. But Guy still wanted to interview him at some point in a more controlled environment to get a better read on things. So, before he ran off to tell the crime techs about these cameras and the tapes, he asked Justin if he would come to the station tomorrow, and Justin agreed. Around 8 p.m. the following day, Guy was sitting in his office staring at his desk phone. And he was feeling really antsy because his case had taken a huge turn in the last few hours. And now he was waiting on a call that he hoped would be the first step in wrapping this thing up. He still didn't have the surveillance footage, which would take a while. There were 16 cameras located on the property, and crime techs were still going through all the tapes. They also hadn't found any fingerprints at the crime scene either. However, they had used the bullets and the shell casings from the scene to figure out that the murder weapon, the gun that was used to kill Melanie and Bud, was a 9mm. It was information Guy could later use to connect to suspects. Guy had interviewed Justin earlier that day, and even though the 20-year-old had still acted way too casual for someone whose parents had just been violently murdered, Guy didn't think he was actually a solid suspect. For one, there was no motive. Even though Justin admitted that he and his dad were not on great terms at this point, he didn't seem angry with his dad. He also had an alibi. He was at his friend Greg's house for dinner that night, and Guy had confirmed it. And Justin knew about the two safes and which one was more valuable, just like Ashley had. But what Justin had given Guy was a suspect, a man named Cab Tice. Cab used to be Bud's partner, but then he apparently stole from Bud's business, and Justin said he had actually seen his dad and Cab arguing over this money, and how Cab still had not paid Bud back. And so if Bud had any enemies, Cab was very likely one of them. It had taken all day, but Guy had finally tracked down Cab at his used car lot in a town that was located about 20 miles away from the crime scene. And since this lot was actually in a different county, Guy had to ask some deputies from that precinct to go over there and see if Cab was actually there. And so now Guy was just waiting for their call. And a few minutes later, he finally got it. One of the deputies rang him up and said they were at Cab's, and Guy would never believe what they found him doing in the back of the parking lot. He was cleaning out a red SUV. Within the hour, the deputies brought Cab to the station. Now, they couldn't bring the red SUV in or even search it because Cab had not given permission. So Guy would have to see what he could learn from Cab himself. And as soon as Guy sat down across the table from Cab, he instantly knew, Cab Tice was the kind of guy who always had an answer for everything, like the red car. Cab said he was cleaning it because he was going to sell it tomorrow, which sounded way too convenient. But Guy let it slide. And instead, he asked about Cab's relationship with Bud. And to Guy's surprise, Cab launched into a tirade. He said he hated Bud. Everybody did. because Bud nickel and dimed everybody he did business with, even though he was rich. And it was common knowledge he literally carried around a briefcase full of money, like 20 grand, whenever he was doing business deals. And so Cab told Guy about all these people Bud had screwed over, like him and his friend Patrick, who had been relying on Bud to invest in that karate company before Bud apparently pulled out over profitability. And then at some point, Cab said if he was being honest, Bud probably deserved to get murdered. Guy couldn't believe what he was hearing. I mean, Cab had just admitted to despising a murder victim, and also he admitted to knowing that this same murder victim kept cash in his house. So the next thing he asked Cab for was an alibi. But Cab had an answer for that too. He said he was over at this other used car lot meeting about a potential business deal, and he said that lot was about an hour and a half away from the Billings' home, and he gave Guy the number for the people he had been with when he was over there so Guy could call and confirm it. And Guy just got up and left the room to do just that. And like Cab said, his business partners confirmed he really was there during the time Melanie and Bud were killed. And so when Guy hung up the phone, he was frustrated. He had felt sure that Cab had to be involved, but there just was not enough evidence to keep him here. So Guy headed back towards the interrogation room to tell Cab he could go home, but before he got there, he noticed one of his detectives running down the hallway towards him. And when he got to Guy, the detective told him that after looking through hours and hours of footage from the Billings' house, they had found something that Guy needed to see. Late on July 10th, over 24 hours after Bud and Melanie Billings were murdered, Guy and another detective sat in front of a TV in silence, watching footage from the Billings' home surveillance system. The shot they were looking at was from an outdoor camera, and it showed a red vehicle pulling up to the home around 7 p.m. Now, the license plates were covered, but Guy could tell this vehicle was not the same one Cab Tice was caught cleaning. The vehicles were both red, but this, in the video, was a passenger van, not an SUV like the one Cab had. And so this, along with Cab's alibi, meant they had virtually no evidence that Cab was the killer. But Guy quickly forgot about Cab, because what he saw next on this video shocked him. 5 people wearing all black, gloves, masks, and carrying guns jumped out of the red van. They immediately split up and without hesitation ran to different points outside of the home. And then the footage inside the house showed these intruders entering from 3 places: a bedroom slider door and a back utility door, both of which must have been unlocked because none of those were forced open, and then of course the front door, which was kicked in. They all stormed into the living room where Bud was watching TV and where Melanie soon appeared. There was no sound, but Guy could see them talk to Bud before one of them shot the floor. After that, some of them zip-tied Bud's wrists, and then the one who fired at the floor then shot Bud in each of his legs. And then after that, they dragged the couple down the hallway to what Guy assumed was the bedroom, where they disappeared. And unfortunately, there were not any cameras in the bedroom. Shortly after that, Guy saw on some outdoor footage the 5 intruders reappearing, leaving the house now with a safe, and then they drove away in the van. The whole thing happened in less than 10 minutes, and they were only in the home for maybe 4 minutes. After watching this footage, Guy just leaned back in his chair, feeling completely stunned. All along, he'd been thinking this was a robbery gone wrong, but what he had just watched seemed more like a military raid. It involved what appeared to be a sort of ruthless precision that seemed out of proportion for this small-town family home. But now, Guy knew he must be missing something crucial about the Billings' family. It could be that maybe Bud was involved in some kind of criminal enterprise, and the extreme security at his home was to protect the family from his various shady associates. If that was the case, it was more likely this was some kind of hired hit done by professionals, and the safe was just stolen to cover up what really happened. And if that was true, it changed Guy's entire case and basically made all of his suspects viable again. Cab's alibi was now worthless. The fact that he was not physically at the crime scene didn't matter, because maybe he hired a hitman. Similarly, just because Justin and Ashley knew which safe had money didn't matter either, because again, they could have hired hitmen to do this. But now, in order to narrow it down, Guy, of course, needed to find the killers, the supposed hitmen. And since he now had an actual image of the killer's red van, he decided he would release it to the public in case anybody in the area had seen it. The next morning, Guy was at his desk drinking some coffee. He just released the image of the red van to the public, and now he was just waiting for local tips to come in. In the meantime, he'd also been looking into other areas of Bud and Melanie's life to see if there was anything that explained the apparent trained team of assassins that stormed their home. And he found out that Bud used to work in the strip club scene, and he was known as a local investor for businesses in the area. But Guy didn't see how any of that connected to the murders yet. And all of his initial suspects, who he just put back on the table, were off of it again. He'd learned that Cab Tice was basically homeless and living at the used car lots that he worked at, which certainly gave him a motive for robbing and killing Bud, but no means. Because if Cab was broke, it was unlikely he could have afforded one hitman, let alone 5 well-trained hitmen. And then as for Ashley and Justin, even if, that safe had been stolen as a decoy, to show that it couldn't have been them because, they knew where the money was, well, there was still no clear motivation for either of them wanting their parents dead. Guy knew that Ashley had taken over operations for Bud's business, and so, perhaps she wanted the whole business to herself. But with her parents' death, it meant that she, sort of by default, would become in charge of her 9 siblings, which was going to be a lot of work and stress, and so Guy wasn't really sure that trade-off made any sense. As for Justin, he just didn't seem like he had enough anger to want Bud or Melanie dead. Plus, he was the one that literally pointed out to Guy that there were cameras all over the house. And so it was doubtful he would send hitmen to a home he knew was littered with surveillance cameras, only to tip the police off to go look at the camera footage. But just then, an officer poked his head into Guy's office and told him that a woman had just called the tip line, and she believed she had actually seen that red van in her neighbor's backyard. An hour later, Guy, along with another detective, stood in the backyard of a home in Pensacola, Florida, located about 15 miles away from the Billings' home. This house belonged to the neighbors of that woman who had called their tip line. Basically, they were at the house where presumably this red van was located. A couple lived at this house together, but right now, only a woman was home, and she gave the detectives permission to go look around the property. And sure enough, in the back, the detectives found a red passenger van parked behind a shed. The van was missing its license plate, and also there were all these patches of black spray paint all over it, like somebody had been trying to alter its appearance. At some point, the other detective wandered away from the van and began walking around, and then a minute later, he yelled to Guy to come over and look at something. And so Guy jogged over, and he saw there was this burned out fire pit right in the backyard, and when Guy looked inside of it, his jaw dropped. At the bottom, in the ashes, was a pile of partially burned black clothes, just like the kind of outfits that the killers were wearing in the footage. Guy turned to look at the home they were standing behind. At this point, Guy knew they had to get that van towed, and they had to bring the couple who owned this place in for questioning, because that couple either knew who killed the Billings or they had done it themselves. It would be a few hours before Guy finally spoke to the husband of the woman who had let them into the backyard, and when he did, that man told him everything. Based on multiple confessions and surveillance footage, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bud and Melanie Billings on the evening of July 9th, 2009. Around 7 p.m., the killers stormed into the Billings' home. As they did, they could hear their 4 other hired accomplices running through the house as well from where they had entered, and the killer knew they would all congregate in the living room as planned. They had all practiced for this moment for a month, so everybody knew exactly what to do and what their role was. They were ready, and their execution would be flawless. So the killer ran into the living room, and by the time they got there, their other accomplices had arrived there too. And so the team of 5 swarmed Bud, who had been watching TV, and they also grabbed Melanie as she ran into the room screaming. The killer then struck Bud and demanded to know where he kept his money. But Bud said he didn't have any, which the killer knew was a lie. Because it was practically common knowledge that Bud kept a lot of money in his home. That was why Bud had so much security and lived in the middle of nowhere to protect his money. And so the killer was not going to let Bud lie his way out of this. And so they pulled out their gun and fired a warning shot right into the floor. That way Bud and Melanie knew they were serious. Bud flinched, but when the killer asked the same question about the money, Bud still said he didn't have any. And that's when the killer became enraged. They coldly ordered their accomplices to tie Bud up. And then once he was, the killer walked over and shot Bud in the leg. And even though Bud began screaming and so did Melanie, the killer, calm as can be, just asked their question again. Where is the money? But amazingly, again, Bud gave the same reply. And so the killer aimed his gun at Bud's other leg and shot that one too. At this point, Bud and Melanie are screaming at the top of their lungs, and the killer and their accomplices just grab Bud and Melanie and begin dragging them down the hallway towards the bedroom. And when they got into the bedroom, the killer smiled, because the closet door in the bedroom was open, and they could clearly see there was a safe sitting inside. And so the killer told their accomplices to go get some duffel bags ready. They were about to get their cash. And so once the accomplices were gone to get their bags, the killer was alone with Bud and Melanie. And they turned to Bud, who by this point was writhing in pain but quiet, and they asked Bud to open the safe. But through gritted teeth, Bud claimed there was no money inside of it, which made the killer even more furious. How could Bud still keep lying? And so the killer, without even thinking, put their gun right up against Bud's face and shot him through the cheek. Bud fell to the ground, shocked by the blow, but still very much alive. But the killer walked over, they aimed their gun at Bud, and fired several more times. Melanie began screaming right behind them, and so the killer turned and demanded that she open the safe. And when she didn't either, the killer shot her multiple times as well. When the killer's accomplices returned, they knew they were going to be shocked to see Bud and Melanie dead. This was not part of the plan. And the killer was anxious too. They really had not expected this to happen. But the killer thought, you know what? It doesn't matter. We don't need Bud and Melanie. They could just take the safe and break it open later. So together, the accomplices and the killer hauled the heavy safe out of the home and into the waiting van. 10 minutes after they'd arrived, the killer and their accomplices drove back down the Billings' long driveway, eventually returning to their father's home, where they parked the van out back and burned all the clothes that they had worn during the attack. Finally, after all that, the killer went home. And as they were driving, they thought about the safe that they had stolen, and how relieved they were that finally they had some money for their business. It would turn out the person who organized the robbery and eventual murder of Bud and Melanie was one of Bud's former business associates, Patrick Gonzalez. Patrick owned a karate company, and at one point he had tried to get Bud to be an investor. And initially, Bud seemed interested. And for a moment, Patrick felt like all his financial problems were about to go away because here comes Bud with all his cash. But then Bud backed out, citing, lack of profitability. And after that, the karate business failed. And so suddenly, Patrick was desperate for cash and simultaneously feeling very burned by Bud. And like everyone who did business with Bud, they assumed that Bud was very rich. Patrick knew Bud had a huge house, and also he had this state-of-the-art security system, sort of reinforcing the idea that, behind the walls of this home, there was great wealth. In reality, the reason Bud had a big house and had the security system was just for his kids. He'd worked hard to build them this big, safe house. But to Patrick, he was convinced Bud had potentially millions of dollars stored in that home, and he was going to get it. So, before the murders, Patrick asked his father, Leonard Gonzalez, and a group of men he knew from working at a mechanic shop to help him rob the Billings. And under Patrick's guidance, using his self-defense knowledge, the group trained for a month to pull off what they thought would be a very smooth, efficient heist. Killing the Billings was never a part of the plan. It was just about taking the money that Patrick had convinced them all was going to be in this house. However, Patrick had become enraged once he had confronted Bud and felt like Bud was lying to him and further, insulting him, and so he had killed the couple. And so after Guy and his team found the van at Patrick's father's house, police brought the father, Leonard, in for questioning, and very quickly, he turned his son in. Patrick Gonzalez was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. As for his father, Leonard Gonzalez, he received 2 17-and-a-half-year sentences, and the other accomplices involved in the attack got between 22 years and life. While this is just speculation, it's believed that the reason Bud and Melanie did not give up the code to that safe is because they knew in doing that, the killer and the accomplices would see there really was no cash in there, and they wouldn't stop until they searched the whole house and found their cash. And they knew that their cash was actually located upstairs in the second safe where their children were. And so very likely, Bud and Melanie essentially died, ensuring that these intruders never went upstairs and so did not harm their kids. As for the 9 kids, they were raised by Ashley and her husband Blue, who eventually moved into the Billings' home. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen Podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Before I record any story for any platform, I always tell that story to my wife first. She's basically my gauge of whether the story makes sense, whether it's interesting, and most times her reaction is pretty neutral. But today's story, she said it was so unusual, she found herself on the edge of her seat just wondering what the ending was going to be because she really couldn't guess it. And then at the end, when I revealed the ending, she says to me, "Wait, are you serious?" But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please spend a considerable amount of time out in the freezing cold with no gloves on, then come back inside and warm your hands up by placing them directly on the 5-star review button's neck. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Alexandra Ignatovic, or Sandra for short, was born in 1967 in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, Canada. Her parents, who had immigrated to Canada from Yugoslavia, were both extremely hardworking people who also had big, warm personalities and great senses of humor. They would pass all 3 of those qualities on to their daughter, which in turn made her a very popular person from a young age. In addition to her attractive personality, Sandra was also considered very physically attractive, so much so that when she was a teenager, her friends began to encourage her to compete in beauty pageants. Sandra was always flattered by these remarks, but would laugh them off, saying she didn't belong in something like that. But in 1985, during Sandra's senior year of high school, she finally gave in to her friends' suggestions and entered a local beauty contest called the Miss Burnaby Pageant. And much to her shock, but not to her friends, she would win. and this win would automatically enter her into the huge Miss Canada beauty competition that year, though she would lose that one. However, Sandra was not remotely fazed by the loss. She actually thought it was pretty funny that she had gotten as far as she had. After high school, Sandra lived at home with her parents and attended a technical school to become a dental assistant. During this time, Sandra and her mom, Sedenka, who she was very close with, developed a hobby that they did together on the weekends. On nice days, they would find local open houses, and they would pretend to be in the market for buying a home, when in reality, they just wanted to walk around the property and fantasize about what it would be like to live there. In 1987, when Sandra was 21 years old and was now working full-time as a dental assistant but still living at home, she and her mother, like usual, went to an open house one weekend in their neighborhood, and once they arrived, it was very crowded, and so they made their way off to the side and just began chatting in their family's native tongue, Serbo-Croatian. And so as they're doing this, a woman they didn't recognize walks up to them. She was this short, older woman with rosy cheeks who was grinning ear to ear, and when she reached the mother and daughter, she very excitedly began speaking in Serbo-Croatian as well. She said her name was Jelka Pesek, and she couldn't help but overhear them speaking in her native tongue. Like Sandra's parents, Jelka had immigrated to Canada from Yugoslavia, and like Sandra and her mom, Jelka was at this open house pretending to be in the market for a home when really she was just fantasizing same as they were. So these commonalities they shared immediately put them all at ease, and before long, all three of them were chatting and laughing like they were old friends. Over the course of their 15 or so minute-long conversation, Jelka eventually asked Sandra pretty point blank if she was single or in a relationship. And Sandra, who was a little caught off guard by the abrupt question, said, "I'm single." At which point, Jelka lit up, and with a smile on her face, she said, "Well, I'd love for you to meet my son Joe. He's about your age and single too." Sandra smiled, but before she could respond, Jelka kind of waved her off like she knew she was being too pushy, and she just said, "Look, our family owns an automotive shop in town. It's called Sam & Sons. If either of you ever have car troubles, it's on the house. Bring your car in. And if you, Sandra, swing by, I'll introduce you to Joe." Then she handed Sandra a business card and said her goodbyes to both of them and then turned and walked away. Once she was gone, Sandra and her mother kind of chuckled about the conversation they had just had, and then they went back to just enjoying the open house. And by that evening, when the mother and daughter had gotten back to their own home, they had more or less forgotten about Jelka. However, the following day, while Sandra was out running some errands, her car's engine started making really loud knocking sounds. While she didn't know what they meant, she knew that she really needed to have someone look at her car, and so as she began to look around, wondering if an auto body shop just happened to be close to her, she remembered Jelka from the day before giving her that business card for her auto body shop, and so Sandra pulled over to the side of the road, she fished inside of her purse, and she pulled out that card, the business card, and she saw the address of the auto body shop was only a couple of blocks away, and so she merged back onto the road and she began driving over. When she arrived outside of Sam & Sons Auto Body Shop, she parked in their front lot, and then she got out and she made her way into the front office, and then as soon as she stepped inside, she saw right ahead of her was this big desk, and behind the desk was Jelka. And as soon as Jelka saw Sandra coming in, Jelka lit up and she said, "Oh my goodness, you're here, come here, come here. I gotta introduce you to my son." And that's when Sandra said, "Well, actually, I'm here because my car actually broke down today. And I was wondering if, you could have a look at it." And immediately Jelka said, "Oh, of course." She grabbed a mechanic, she pulled him over and said, "Right now, go out and get Sandra's car. She has to be at the front of the line." And so the mechanic went out to get Sandra's car, and then Sandra said, "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna just go step outside and just let me know when it's done." But Jelka would say, No. You have to meet my son. Hold on just a minute." And so Sandra just kind of stood in the waiting room, kind of feeling a little bit awkward, and Jelka ran back into the back room behind the desk, and then she came running back out a few minutes later, and just a few seconds behind her was this handsome man in a crisp suit who had short dark hair and a perfectly manicured mustache, and Jelka immediately grabbed him and kind of wheeled him out from behind the desk and brought him right in front of Sandra, and with a huge grin on her face, she says to Sandra, "This is Joe, this is my son. He's single, you're single, you two should go on a date." And so Sandra and Joe immediately laughed because it was so pushy and so forward, it was just kind of comical. But over the course of their very short interaction, they both found each other attractive and they actually agreed to meet up for a date. And over the course of the next few weeks, the pair would go on many dates and they would become inseparable. Joe would take Sandra to the nicest restaurants in town, they would go dancing, and then sometimes they'd just hop on Joe's motorcycle and go for long rides in the countryside. Less than a month after their first meeting, Sandra was already telling her family and friends that Joe might be the one. And she would be right, because almost exactly a month after their first meeting, Joe would ask Sandra to marry him, and she would say yes. Sandra was beyond excited. She knew this proposal had been abrupt, but she didn't care. She felt like Joe was perfect. However, there was one detail about Joe that Sandra hadn't really seen fully yet, and that was his mother. Sandra was aware that Jelka could be a bit pushy. After all, she did literally tell Sandra to date her son while they stood directly in front of her son. However, after that interaction, Sandra had really not spent much time around Jelka and so hadn't formed much of an opinion of her. But as soon as wedding preparations began, that would change. Jelka wanted to plan every single detail of the wedding. You should get married in this church. You should buy this gown from the store. Your bridesmaids should wear these dresses. Here's a great music list for the wedding reception. Although she presented these as suggestions, they were more like demands. At first, Sandra tried to just roll with it and allowed Jelka to have her way with a number of the decisions, but after each concession, it just seemed like Jelka would come back with even more demands. Finally, Sandra had just had enough, and she told Jelka, "You gotta stop inserting yourself into every single wedding planning decision. This is my wedding. This is Joe's wedding, not yours." And shockingly, Jelka responded by effectively saying, "I know better than you, and I'm not going to stop telling you how to have the best wedding because I want it to be the best." Sandra was dumbfounded. She felt like she literally could not stop Jelka, and so she went to her fiancé, and although she knew she was putting him in a really awkward situation, she told him he had to step in and tell his mom to back down, that she was totally overbearing and making this wedding process a nightmare. At first, Joe tried to act like Sandra was overreacting, but Sandra just was not having it, and she basically said, "I will postpone this wedding if you don't handle this." And so after a deep sigh, Joe told Sandra, "Okay, I'll go talk to my mom." And sure enough, Joe would. And Jelka would step back as a result of this conversation. However, it was plainly obvious that Jelka was not happy about this. And to show her displeasure, for the rest of the wedding planning cycle, Jelka refused to look at or talk to Sandra. But as upsetting as this was for Sandra, ultimately she was kind of okay with it because one, Joe had demonstrated that he could have her back when she really needed him, and two, she didn't really like talking to Jelka at this point. She found her incredibly annoying, and so to have Jelka ignoring her was kind of a good deal. A few weeks before their wedding, Sandra and Joe, who at that point both still lived with their parents, decided to go out and get an apartment they could share together as a couple. And they found one. It was very small and was the only one they could actually afford, but it was relatively close to both of their families and their work, so they took it. After getting the keys, Sandra and her mom would spend a very fun weekend going out to yard sales and discount stores to decorate and furnish the apartment, and by the time they were done, Sandra and Joe loved it. On June 11th, 1988, Sandra and Joe finally got married in front of all of their friends and family, and everyone seemed to have a great time, except for Jelka. Then, after the wedding, the new couple headed off to Hawaii for their honeymoon. A week later, Sandra and Joe returned to Vancouver, and when they walked into their new apartment, they were both shocked. The entire place had been completely redecorated. Couch covers had been switched out, the kitchen had been reorganized, bathrooms had different colored towels, the bed had different sheets on it, and it was even facing a different direction. After calling around to their families, they quickly discovered Jelka was responsible. She had used Joe's keys to slip into the apartment while they were on vacation. Sandra was furious. She and her mother had worked so hard to furnish and decorate the apartment to make it feel like her own, and now it just felt like Jelka's. It was so rude what she had done. Sandra literally couldn't believe it. Despite putting everything back the way it had been in their apartment, this was a massive violation of their privacy, and Sandra openly told Joe that she wanted nothing to do with his mother. However, it wasn't that simple for Joe. Despite her transgressions, Joe still loved his mom, and he got his paycheck from his mom. She was literally his boss at the auto body shop, so he couldn't just disown her, nor did he want to. This caused a lot of friction between the couple, but ultimately they just kind of accepted that they would need to find a way to live with Yelka and her intrusive behavior because she wasn't going anywhere. But despite Sandra's best efforts to put up with Yelka, Yelka made that nearly impossible on a regular basis. Shortly after the apartment redecorating incident, where afterwards Joe and Sandra told Yelka, "You cannot sneak into our apartment when we are gone," Yelka began sneaking into the couple's apartment when they were gone. Yelka had made a copy of her son's keys and just came and went as she pleased. At first, all she did was straighten things up around the apartment and periodically would go through their fridge, throwing away old food and sometimes replacing certain food items with other food items that she believed were better in some way. At first, Joe and Sandra actually didn't notice, but when it seemed like their entire fridge was starting to become full of food neither of them remembered purchasing, they confronted Yelka, and sure enough, she admitted to it. But the way she framed it was that she was simply swinging by and dropping off groceries. After this admission, privately, Sandra told Joe that he had to step in and stop Yelka from doing this. They had already told her, "You can't do this," and she's doing it all over again. And Joe, he would tell his wife, "Oh yeah, I'm going to tell her to stop for sure." He actually would not. And so Yelka would just continue to come in and out of their apartment as she pleased. Sandra was furious and felt like she had totally lost control of the situation, but at the same time, she started having feelings that, maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she was wrong about Yelka, and she was just hypersensitive to what she was doing, and that in reality, Yelka was being really helpful. But when Yelka, during one of her secret apartment visits, removed half of Sandra's entire wardrobe from her closet and replaced it with clothing Yelka had bought, Sandra officially had had enough. Instead of waiting for Joe to come home that evening and to figure out what to do together, Sandra just hopped in her car and drove right over to her in-laws' house. When she arrived, she ran up the front steps. She didn't even knock on their door. She simply opened it and screamed at Yelka, who was straight ahead in the kitchen, that she can never come in their apartment without permission ever again. Then she screamed at Yelka to give her her clothing back immediately. Yelka seemed totally unfazed by this, and instead of saying sorry or trying to make an excuse, she just said very matter-of-factly, "You don't look good in your clothing. I know what you look good in." Then she walked over to a closet near the front door, pulled out several dresses and blouses and kind of chucked them at Sandra, and then holding her crumpled clothes in her arms, Sandra glared at Yelka for an extra second before turning and storming out of the house back to her car. When she got back to her apartment, Joe had come home at this point, so Sandra walked in and pretty much immediately laid into him. She explained how his mom had taken her clothes and that now she had just completely had it. She was done with Yelka. She can't come back in here. It's over. It's done. But while the couple fought, there was a knock on their front door. The couple stopped talking and Joe stood up and walked over to the door and he opened it. And shockingly, standing on the other side was Yelka and her husband, Sam. Sandra saw them and literally ran over and slammed the door in their face. But through the now shut door, she heard Yelka call out, "Please let us in. I have something very important I want to tell you." Sandra could sense that Yelka's tone seemed different somehow. Perhaps she was here to apologize. It certainly seemed possible given recent events. And so while holding the doorknob, Sandra turned and looked at Joe, who had a look of I don't know what to do on his face. And then with a very frustrated sigh, Sandra turned the doorknob and opened the front door again, and immediately Yelka smiled at the couple and walked in like she owned the place. Sam followed behind her, but seemed wholly uninvested in whatever it was they were there for. Yelka strode right into the kitchen and she took a seat at the head of the table and then beckoned Sandra and Joe to come over and sit down as well. Sandra was already regretting her decision to let them in, but she did want to hear what Yelka had to say, and so she walked over and sat down, as did Joe. Once everyone was sitting around the table, Yelka smiled and said, "Sandra, Joe, we're going to make an $85,000 down payment on this beautiful 2-story house for you two to live in. We know this apartment is small and you want to start a family, and we want to give you the best home to do that in." Sandra and Joe were dumbstruck. They made very little money and had almost no savings, and so home ownership was not exactly on the horizon for them, although it was something they often fantasized about. But now, this fantasy could become a reality if they just said yes to Yelka. And so with Yelka sitting there staring at them intently with a big grin on her face, Eagerly awaiting their answer, the couple exchanged a few quick glances at each other, kind of feeling each other out, and then they said, "Okay, yeah, thank you so much." Yelka was extremely pleased. She hugged them both and asked them to come by the property the next day to have a look around, and then Yelka and Sam got up and they left. That night, Sandra and Joe lay awake in bed talking about this incredible thing that had happened, and they came to the conclusion that Yelka must have been trying to make some sort of peace offering, that this was effectively a way for her to say sorry for what had transpired between them. And so by the time Sandra fell asleep that night, she was feeling very optimistic that her relationship with Yelka was about to improve. The following day, Sandra and Joe drove over to the house that they had just agreed to let Yelka and Sam put the down payment on, and right away, what stood out to Sandra was the home's proximity to Yelka's house. It was only about 5 minutes drive away, much closer than their current apartment was to Yelka's house. Also, as soon as Yelka arrived in her car and got out to talk to them on the sidewalk, she was absolutely brimming with excitement, talking about how she couldn't wait to start decorating the inside of the house. It was like she was moving into the house. Alarm bells were going off in Sandra's head. This arrangement clearly was a mistake. But at the same time, Sandra felt like they were in too deep. They had already agreed to do this. How could they possibly back out now? So against her better judgment, a few weeks later, the sale of this new house was finalized and Sandra and Joe moved in. But within a week of living there, everything fell apart. Sandra had mentioned to Joe that she wanted to put in a simple red accent tile along the back of the kitchen wall. Joe had apparently relayed this information to his mother, who promptly arrived at the house specifically to tell Sandra she wasn't allowed to do that Yelka already had plans for the kitchen. A massive fight broke out between the two women that ended with Sandra saying, "You know what? I'm done. I'm leaving. I'm moving in with my mom." Then Sandra did just that. She grabbed her things, put them in the car, and she left. Joe, who by now seemed to have just given up trying to keep the peace between his wife and his mother, didn't even try to stop her. It looked like Joe and Sandra's marriage was destined to fail. Yelka was just too much to overcome. But only a week after moving back in with her mother, Sandra started to feel nauseous. She took a pregnancy test and it revealed that she was pregnant. She was going to have Joe's baby. Sandra had a decision to make: return to Joe and by extension return to Yelka, or raise the child on her own. She called Joe to break the pregnancy news and talk about the way ahead for them, and he was extremely excited and begged her to come back and live in the house together again, and he promised he would keep his mother under control. By the end of the call, Sandra decided she was willing to go back and give it another shot, not because Joe was so convincing or that she thought Yelka was really going to change, but because she felt like she owed it to her unborn child. And much to Sandra's surprise, once she moved back into the house with Joe, it actually was much better than before. Namely because Yelka actually seemed to be giving them space. Clearly, Joe had laid down the law with her, and Yelka was respecting it. She gave them so much space that by the time Sandra actually gave birth to her son Brandon, she found herself secretly starting to kind of like Yelka, just a little bit. 6 months after Brandon was born, Sandra and Joe were both starting to feel very run down from being on baby duty 24/7, and so Joe suggested they go out on a date night that Friday. Sandra loved the idea and asked Joe to get them a babysitter, and then once he said he had, they made reservations for their favorite restaurant. When Friday came around, as Sandra was getting ready for the night, they heard the babysitter knock on the front door. Sandra opened the door and saw Yelka. Despite her recent good behavior, Sandra was still very much on edge, wondering when the old Yelka was going to come back out again. And so her immediate reaction to seeing Yelka on the other side of this door was, "What are you doing here?" Yelka looked at her funny and said, "I'm your babysitter. Joe asked me." Sandra immediately whipped her head around and looked at Joe, who was now standing very sheepishly in the middle of the room. Before Sandra could say anything to him, Yelka had slipped past her into the house and was already talking about how she and Brandon were going to have such a wonderful night together and that everything was going to be just fine. Sandra shut the door and then grabbed Joe and pulled him into another room and told him she didn't like this, that he should have told her he was going to have her babysit their son. But Joe told her she was overreacting, that, despite their past issues, his mom was really excellent with kids. This would be fine. Sandra did not like this, but eventually conceded, and then before the couple left, Sandra gave Jelka very specific instructions for how to care for Brandon, what to feed him, what time to put him to bed, etc. And the whole time, Jelka just reassured Sandra that it was going to be just fine, just go out and have fun. Finally, after giving all the instructions she could possibly think of, Sandra and Joe said goodbye and they left. They went out to their favorite restaurant, and then afterwards they went to a club to go dancing. And as soon as they got there, Sandra stepped away and hopped on a payphone to call Jelka to make sure everything was going okay with their son. And when Jelka picked up, she informed Sandra that the boy was, quote, out like a light, because apparently she had given him some tea from the old country. Sandra said, "What? I told you he only takes breast milk. What did you give him?" And Jelka just laughed and said, "Don't worry about it. It's fine. He's asleep. Go enjoy yourself." Sandra was horrified. She hung up on Jelka and ran back into the club. She grabbed Joe and said, "Your mom just fed something to Brandon that she shouldn't have. We have to go." The two ran from the club, they hopped in the car, and then Sandra flew back to their house. As soon as they were parked outside, she ran up the steps into the house, right past Jelka, into her son's nursery, and then standing next to his crib, she reached down and she lifted him up, which should have woken him up, but it didn't. He just lay limp in her arms. And so immediately Sandra pressed his mouth up against her ear to see if he was still breathing, and barely she could tell he was still breathing. But despite screaming his name and moving him around, nothing was waking him up. And so by this point, Jelka had come into the room and she was trying to convince Sandra that this was no big deal, that, the tea from the old country works great. You got nothing to worry about. But at this point, Sandra is panicking and she's screaming at Jelka to tell her what was in the tea you gave him. But Jelka just wouldn't give her an answer. She just kept laughing and saying it was fine. And so finally, Sandra just takes her son and runs past Jelka, runs past Joe. She runs out to the car. She strapped her little boy into his car seat, and then she flew to the emergency room. And then when she got there, she hopped out. She's carrying her baby. She's hysterically crying. And she runs in through the doors, and all the doctors and nurses, they run over and they take the child from her, and they're asking all these questions. They're trying to figure out what's going on, and they start feeling for a pulse, and they would find one. However, it was very, very slow. And so they whisked Brandon away into an exam room to work on him and figure out what was going on. Meanwhile, Sandra just had to pace in the waiting room, crying hysterically, having no idea what's happening to her boy. But luckily, just a few minutes later, one of the doctors would come back out of the exam room and they would tell Sandra that, we think your son's going to be just fine. We don't know what he consumed, but whatever it was not good, and he should never have that again. And then he told Sandra she could come back and actually be with her son again. And so Sandra left the waiting room and she went down the hall. She went into the room where her son was, and there, laying on this bed with wires and tubes connected to him, is her little boy, who still looks totally lifeless. And so Sandra walked around and she sat down next to the bed and she laid her head down on the pillow and just looked at her son. And right there, in that moment, she decided that she was officially done with Jelka, even if it meant being done with Joe. A few minutes later, when Joe arrived by himself, Sandra would tell him he needed to choose. It was either going to be her or his mother. Unlike other times, Joe was not quick to come to his wife's side. In his mind, Sandra had become as much to blame for the drama as his mother was. And so after getting very frustrated with Sandra, he said, "You know what? You keep yelling at my mom, and I don't like it. She only wants to help and be supportive, and you just can't accept that. So I'm sorry, but I'm choosing my mom, not you." And Sandra would say, "Fine." And then the two of them just sat in silence on opposite sides of their son for the next hour until the doctors came back in and gave them the okay to take their son home, at which point Sandra immediately stood up and grabbed Brandon, and she and her son left the hospital without another word to Joe. She would drive her son to her mother's house and drop him off with her parents, and then she would go back to Joe's house, collect most of her things, and then move into her mom's house with her son. The following day, she would file for divorce. Immediately, the divorce became very nasty. Sandra didn't want Brandon anywhere near Jelka, so she decided to seek full custody of him. However, Joe, who by this point had gone from being something of an innocent bystander caught in the middle of two people he loved, to being aggressively on his mother's side, and therefore aggressively opposed to Sandra, told Sandra that he would be seeking full custody of Brandon as well. While these legal proceedings were going on, Joe's parents took it upon themselves to change all the locks of the house, knowing some of Sandra's things were still tucked away in the attic. Jelka also had their lawyer send Sandra a letter explaining that she was now forbidden from stepping foot inside of that house without express permission from Jelka. But as Joe and his mother made these punitive moves, Sandra would receive a huge legal break. The judge in their case had come to a decision. Sandra would get full custody of Brandon, and Joe would be required to pay child support and an alimony payment. The judge also ruled that Sandra would get primary ownership status of the house that Yelka had put the down payment on, and on top of all of that, based on Yelka's previous behavior, she was forbidden from having any contact with both Sandra and Brandon. Joe and his family were beyond outraged, but their only recourse was to be on their best behavior and try to file an appeal and have the judge change the ruling. So in the meantime, Joe very reluctantly and bitterly moved out of the house, and then Sandra and Brandon moved back in. Over the following few months, Joe didn't pay a dime of child support or alimony payments to Sandra. He also didn't bother to try to get in touch about seeing his son. Sandra was very upset about this. However, she was mostly just upset for her son, whose father basically had abandoned him. But as the silence between them grew, Sandra started to think to herself that maybe it was for the best. Fast forward about a year and a half to the summer of 1992, Joe was still not paying any support money to Sandra, and he and Sandra were still not talking, minus during court appearances for the appeals that had been filed. And during those short interactions, Joe would be openly cold and hateful toward his ex-wife, which Sandra could clearly tell made Yelka very happy. But Sandra didn't care. She had her son, she had the house, and she felt like no matter what they said or they did, they weren't going to stop her from trying to have the best life she could have. But Sandra's life was about to take a drastic and unexpected turn. In June of that year, Sandra walked out to her mailbox in the morning and found a small package with no return address on it. She brought the package inside, opened it up, and saw that it contained a paperback novel called The Deaths of Cindy James. It was a non-fiction account of a woman named Cindy James, who for years had been harassed by some unknown person who ultimately killed her and got away with it. Sandra's first thought when she saw this book was that, maybe she had accidentally signed up for a book club or something. And so she just put the book on the table and went about her day. That evening, after work, she saw the book on the table and just picked it up and sat down and began flipping through the pages for the first time. And right away, she noticed someone had underlined several passages in the book. When Sandra began reading these highlighted sections in the book, she started to feel very uncomfortable. All the highlighted sections were descriptions of the specific awful things that had happened to Cindy. Namely, her tree in her front yard had been lit on fire. She started getting threatening phone calls at all hours of the night. Strangers would lurk on her property. Cars followed her around when she was out in town. And then the last underlined passage was about Cindy's death, and only 2 words were underlined. You're dead. Sandra didn't know what to make of this book, but it definitely felt threatening. She assumed Joe had sent it just to be cruel. 2 days later, Sandra was sitting in her living room with a friend when they both suddenly heard a strange sound coming from the outside of the front of her house. All of the windows that looked into the front yard had the curtains drawn, and so Sandra and her friend stood up and walked over and pulled one of the curtains aside, and right in the middle of the front of her property on her front lawn, her tree was on fire, just like the Cindy James book. In fact, as soon as Sandra saw this, she handed Brandon to her friend and she ran into the kitchen and she grabbed the book, the Cindy James book, and she ran back and she flipped through the pages and she found the passage about the tree and she showed it to her friend and she said, "Look, someone sent me this 2 days ago and now they're doing what's happening in the book to me." Sandra would call the fire department and the police department and they would all show up and they would put the fire out. And then afterwards, Sandra would speak to the officers and she would explain the situation about her divorce and how she'd received this book. But the police didn't have much they could do. Even if Joe had done this, there was no proof. So they just told her to, be vigilant and report anything strange you see. And if you call us, we'll come out immediately. Over the following weeks, a man started calling Sandra's house in the middle of the night. He never said anything. He just breathed into the phone. The calls became so frequent that Sandra had to disconnect her phone at night just so she and Brandon could sleep. She would tell the police about the calls, but again, there was just nothing they could do. About a month after the calls had begun, Sandra was giving her son a bath in their house, and after he was all clean, she scooped him up in a towel and she carried him across the hall into his room, which was on the first floor in the back of the house. And when she walked into his room, the light was off, so it's totally dark, and the curtains that cover the back window were actually pulled to the side, revealing a clear view into the backyard. And standing right on the outside of her house, looking into her son's window, is this large man with a ski mask on. And he can clearly see that Sandra is looking at him, but he's totally unfazed. In fact, when he can tell that Sandra has made eye contact with him, he leans forward into the glass before turning and walking out of sight. Sandra immediately runs all over her house, making sure all the doors are locked, and then as she's reconnecting her phone to call 911, she hears banging on windows and she hears banging on the walls, and then by the time the police show up, there's no sign that anybody was there. And so once again, the police had to say to her, "Sorry, you're on your own." The next day, when Sandra noticed a car was now clearly following her in town, she realized all of the underlined sections of the Cindy James book had now happened to her in real life, except for one, the last underlined section, the one where Cindy dies. Scared for her life, Sandra hired a private investigator to both watch her home and try to figure out who was behind this, but after a couple of weeks, the nightly calls and occasional footsteps outside of her windows at night continued, and the private detective had gotten no closer to figuring out who was behind this. However, he did tell Sandra that he had been following Joe around and watching him and his family, and they all appeared to just be living a normal life. On the afternoon of August 5th of that year, so 2 months after receiving the Cindy James book in the mail, Sandra walked out of her dental office with her coworker Bernice. That day, Sandra was supposed to give Bernice a ride home. So the pair walked across the parking lot to the road where Sandra's car was parked. Sandra hopped in the driver's seat and fired up the engine, while Bernice hopped in the passenger seat and bent down to shove her bag underneath the seat below her. As Bernice was bent down, she suddenly heard gunfire on her left. She screamed and stayed bent forward, gripping the back of her head to protect herself, and then when the shooting stopped, Bernice sat up and looked out the front window and she saw a red car speeding away from them. Then she turned to look at Sandra and she saw her coworker was slumped forward. 2 of the 6 shots that had been fired from that red car had struck Sandra in the head. Bernice ran out of the car and she got help, and before long the police and paramedics were there, but by the time they reached Sandra, it was too late. She was already deceased. After her death, the police immediately turned their attention to Joe as their primary suspect. However, despite showing no emotion when he was told the mother of his child had just been murdered, he did have a rock-solid alibi. He had been at a public swimming pool during the shooting and even had a receipt to prove it. But the police just weren't buying it. Something seemed off about him. So they began staking out Joe's parents' house, which is where he was living at the time, watching to see what Joe did and who he talked to. And for the first 4 days, nothing unusual happened. But on the 5th day, the police were watching the house from a distance when Yelka suddenly came out the front door and hopped in her car and started to back down her driveway. But before she reached the end of the driveway, she came to a stop. Then a man came running out of her house who was neither Joe nor her husband, and he climbed into the back seat of her car and then laid down on the floorboards so no one could see him. The police thought this was very odd, so they decided to trail Yelka. They would follow her to a nearby mall parking garage where she and this man would climb out of the vehicle and go into the mall at different times as if they were trying to make it seem like they didn't know each other. One of the officers would stay in the parking garage watching Yelka's car, while the other officer went into the mall to see what these two were up to. But very quickly, that officer lost sight of both Yelka and this man, and so he had to return back to the parking garage with his partner. A little while later, the 2 officers watched as Yelka returned to her car, and then a few moments later, so too did this man, who promptly climbed back into her car and got down on the floorboards out of sight again. The police would trail Yelka back to her house, where as soon as she parked in the driveway, the man in the back climbed out and walked to the front of the property, hopped in a parked car, and drove off. The police followed this man and pulled him over less than a mile away, and when he got out of the car, something fell out of his pocket that blew the case wide open. It would turn out Joe really hadn't been involved in what happened to Sandra. However, his mother Yelka had. She had grown to hate Sandra so much she had decided she wanted to get rid of her, and she had just the plan in mind. Yelka was obsessed with the story of Cindy James, and so she decided she would force Sandra to relive Cindy's nightmare all the way to its grisly conclusion. After doing some digging, Yelka discovered one of her family friends, a man named Milan Nanatic, had connections to a hitman named David Segoviano. David was really just a seedy criminal willing to do just about anything for money. Yelka instantly told Milan to hire David to take out Sandra. However, she stressed that David had to first carry out all the underlined segments of the Cindy James book before he shot her down. Because Yelka didn't just want to kill Sandra, she wanted to torture her first. Milan Nanatic was the man who was hiding in Yelka's car. The two had driven to that mall so that Yelka could take $30,000 in cash out of a bank that she was paying to Milan for organizing the hit. And then Milan was going to take a portion of that and pay it to David, the shooter. And so when Milan got pulled over by police, when he stood up, the cash that he had been paid by Yelka was jammed in his pockets. And so literally he stood up and hundreds of dollars began falling out of his pockets. And very quickly the police were able to figure out what it was for. Less than a year later, Yelka, Milan, and David were tried and convicted for the murder of Sandra Pesek. They were all given the maximum sentence for first-degree murder in Canada, which is 25 years. Joe Pesek was never charged with a crime. As for Sandra's son, he would go on to be raised by Sandra's mother. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't done this already, please spend a considerable amount of time out in the freezing cold with no gloves on. Then come back inside and warm your hands by placing them directly on the 5-star review button's neck. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning. But in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username for all platforms is just MrBallen, and yes, I really do read most of my direct messages. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see you.